The phone call came at 3 a.m. on a Sunday. I stared at my mother's name flashing on the screen, a woman who hadn't spoken to me in over a year. Not since she chose my sister Rebecca's backyard barbecue over my wedding. A casual garden party with real family friends is more important than your little courthouse ceremony, Marissa, she'd said. Maybe if you'd married someone successful, we'd have made time. Now her voice was shaking, desperate, almost unrecognizable. Sweetheart, we made a terrible mistake. We need to talk about your husband. Can we please come to dinner? Meet him properly? I almost laughed out loud. Because 18 hours earlier, my wedding to billionaire tech mogul Henry Chen had been broadcast on every major news network in America. CNN, Fox, MSNBC. Not because I wanted the attention, but because when you marry a man worth $5 billion whose company just revolutionized artificial intelligence, the media doesn't ask permission. For 38 years, my parents told me I was the family disappointment. Rebecca was the golden child, beautiful, charming, married to a dentist. I was too plain, too serious, too focused on that boring tech job. They didn't know my boring tech job was Chief Innovation Officer at Chen Technologies. They didn't know I'd been dating the CEO for 4 years. They didn't know our little courthouse ceremony was actually an intimate sunset wedding at our Malibu estate with 50 tech billionaires and a dress that cost more than their house. They learned all of this from CNN. Now they wanted in. Now I was sweetheart. Now they were begging. I looked at my husband sleeping peacefully beside me, the man who loved me when I had nothing to offer but myself. Then I pressed the phone to my ear and said the word I'd been waiting a lifetime to say, no, and hung up. This is the story of how I became unbreakable and how my family learned that some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. My name is Marissa Cole. I'm 38 years old, and for the past decade I've worked as a software engineer at a modest tech firm in Columbus, Ohio. Most people who know my family would tell you I'm the disappointment, the daughter who couldn't quite measure up, who married poorly and divorced quietly, who never gave my mother the grandchildren or the son-in-law she could brag about at the country club. The Cole family mansion sits on 3 acres in the wealthiest suburb of Cincinnati, a sprawling Georgian revival with white columns and manicured gardens that my father spent 40 years building his accounting firm to afford. This Thanksgiving, like every Thanksgiving before it, I pulled my 10-year-old Honda into the circular driveway and watched it disappear between my sister's Range Rover and my uncle's Mercedes. I sat in my car for a full minute, hands gripping the steering wheel, reminding myself why I kept coming back year after year, despite the knot in my stomach that started forming the moment I crossed the county line. I was 20 minutes late. I knew this would set the tone for the entire evening, but my therapy appointment had run long, and Dr. Chen insisted we finish discussing my boundaries before I walked into what she called the lion's den. I wore a simple navy dress from Target and flats, practical, comfortable, and exactly the kind of outfit my mother would find 1,000 ways to criticize. Through the tall windows, I could see the family already seated in the formal dining room, and I felt that familiar cocktail of dread and resignation settle into my bones. The moment I stepped through the front door, my mother's voice cut through the murmur of family conversation like a blade. Well, look who finally decided to grace us with her presence. Eleanor Cole sat at the head of the mahogany table in the position that had once belonged to my father, draped in what I recognized as a new Cartier necklace at least $15,000, if I had to guess. Her silver hair was swept into an elegant chignon, and her burgundy silk dress probably cost more than my monthly rent. Every eye at the table turned to me, and I felt the weight of their judgment settle onto my shoulders like a familiar, unwelcome coat. "Sorry I'm late," I said quietly, sliding into the only empty chair, the one farthest from my mother, naturally. Traffic was terrible coming from Columbus. Traffic? My mother repeated the word as if it tasted bad in her mouth. "Marissa, you live 40 minutes away. If you cared enough to be on time, you would have left earlier." She gestured to my sister Lydia, who sat at her right hand in what looked like a designer dress I'd seen in the window of Saks Fifth Avenue. Lydia managed to arrive on time, and she had to coordinate 3 children's schedules and her husband's clinic hours. Lydia smiled at me sympathetically, but there was something else underneath it, something that looked almost like pity mixed with relief that she wasn't the target. "It's okay, Rissa. We haven't started eating yet. You're not that late." The table was spectacular, I had to admit. A massive turkey sat at the center, surrounded by dishes that could have fed 30 people. Truffle mashed potatoes, honey-glazed Brussels sprouts with pancetta, 3 different types of stuffing, a spiral-cut ham glistening with brown sugar glaze, lobster bisque in delicate china cups, artisanal bread baskets from that expensive bakery downtown, and at least 5 different pies visible on the sideboard. I knew without asking that my mother had hired the meal from the most expensive caterer in Cincinnati. She always did. She'd never actually cooked a Thanksgiving dinner in her life, but she'd spend the next week telling her friends at the country club how exhausting it had been to prepare everything from scratch. My Uncle Robert cleared his throat uncomfortably. My Aunt Susan examined her wine glass with sudden intense interest. My cousin's teenagers now looked at their phones under the table. Everyone knew what was coming. We'd all been to these dinners before. We all knew our roles in this familiar, painful play. "That dress," my mother said, her voice dripping with disappointment, as her eyes traveled from my face to my shoes and back again. "Marissa, we talked about this. This is a formal family dinner. You show up looking like you're running errands at the grocery store." "It's Thanksgiving, Mom. I thought we were supposed to be casual and comfortable. You know, grateful for family." "Grateful." She laughed, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Yes, let's talk about gratitude. Lydia is grateful. She married a successful orthodontist, gave me 3 beautiful grandchildren, and contributes to this family's reputation in the community. What exactly are you grateful for?" "Marissa, your failed marriage to that mechanic. Your little job doing whatever it is you do with computers all day. The fact that you're nearly 40 years old and still living alone in that tiny apartment." I felt my face flush hot. This was familiar territory, the comparison game, the public humiliation disguised as motherly concern. Lydia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but said nothing. She never did. My aunt reached for the wine bottle and poured herself a generous glass. "I'm grateful for a lot of things," I said, keeping my voice level and steady. "My health, my independence, my work that I find meaningful." "Independence?" My mother picked up her wine glass, and I could see the light from the chandelier catching on her rings, the diamonds my father had given her over the years, the emerald she'd bought herself last spring. "Is that what we're calling it these days? You rent a 1-bedroom apartment in a mediocre neighborhood and drive a car that's older than some of my grandchildren. Meanwhile, your sister lives in a 5-bedroom colonial in Indian Hill and summers in Hilton Head. But yes, Marissa, you have your independence. How wonderful for you." Around the table, my extended family had gone very still. My younger cousin Emma looked like she wanted to crawl under her chair and disappear. My uncle started serving himself turkey with exaggerated focus, as if by staying busy with food he could pretend this wasn't happening. "Eleanor, maybe we should just start dinner," and my Aunt Susan started, but my mother cut her off with a sharp wave of her manicured hand. "No, Susan, this needs to be said. Someone needs to be honest with Marissa, because clearly no one else will tell her the truth." She turned her attention back to me, and I saw something in her pale blue eyes that I'd seen my entire life. Disappointment so deep and so old, it had curdled into something closer to contempt. "You've always been the family disappointment, sweetheart. We've tried to be supportive, we've tried to help you make better choices, but you just keep making one mistake after another. Honestly, Marissa, you should be grateful we even invite you to these gatherings. Some families would have cut you off completely by now." Lydia laughed, a nervous tinkling sound that she probably thought would lighten the mood, but only made everything worse. "Mom, come on. That's a little harsh. Marissa's doing fine. She doesn't need to be married to be successful." "Doing fine?" my mother repeated mockingly. "Yes, I suppose by her standards she is doing just fine. But then again, low standards do have their advantages, don't they?" Something inside me, something that had been wound tight for 38 years, suddenly clicked into place. Not snapped exactly, but settled with a kind of final, decisive certainty. I'd spent the last 6 months in therapy with Dr. Chen preparing for this moment. I'd spent 5 years quietly paying my mother's bills while she called me a failure to anyone who would listen. I'd spent my entire life trying to earn her love, and I'd finally realized that some people are simply incapable of giving what you need no matter how hard you try or how much you sacrifice. I set down my fork very carefully. The sound of silver on china seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet room. "Mother," I said, and my voice was calmer than I'd ever heard it, steady with a kind of peaceful resolve. "If I'm such a disappointment and such a financial burden to this family, perhaps Lydia should start paying for these extravagant dinners and the $5,000 monthly credit card bills I've been covering for the past 5 years. The table went absolutely, utterly silent. My mother's face drained of color. Lydia's mouth fell open. My uncle's fork clattered against his plate. I continued feeling a strange sense of liberation with each word that left my mouth. "That's $120,000 I've quietly paid to keep you in designer handbags, country club memberships, luxury spa treatments, and catered Thanksgiving dinners, while you stood in front of our entire family and told everyone I was worthless. So please, Mother, let's talk about who the real disappointment is at this table." For a long moment, no one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. My mother opened her mouth closed. It opened it again like a fish gasping for air. I don't know what you're talking about," she finally managed, but her voice had lost all its sharp edges. "Your father left me plenty of money when he died. I don't need your—" An elderly man at the end of the table. Russell Blake, my father's oldest friend and former business partner for over 40 years, slowly stood up. He reached into the leather briefcase he'd set beside his chair and pulled out a thick manila folder. His voice when he spoke was quiet, but carried the weight of absolute certainty. "She's telling the truth, Eleanor, and I have 5 years of bank statements right here to prove it." The silence that followed Russell's statement felt like it lasted an eternity, though it was probably only a few seconds. I watched my mother's face cycle through emotions, shock, confusion, then a flash of something that looked almost like fear before she managed to compose herself into indignant outrage. Russell Blake had been a fixture in our family for as long as I could remember. He'd been my father's college roommate, the best man at my parents' wedding, and eventually his business partner in the accounting firm they built together from nothing. After my father died 5 years ago, Russell had quietly faded from our family gatherings, and I'd always assumed it was because the memories were too painful. Now, looking at the steel in his eyes as he faced my mother across the Thanksgiving table, I realized there might have been other reasons for his absence. He opened the manila folder with deliberate care, pulling out the first sheet of paper and holding it up so everyone at the table could see. "This is a bank statement from Marissa's checking account dated November 2019, 1 month after Henry's funeral." His voice was measured, almost clinical, but there was an edge to it that made everyone lean forward. "You'll notice a payment of $5,000 to Eleanor Cole marked as household expenses. There's another one in December, and January, and every single month for the past 5 years. My Uncle Robert leaned closer, squinting at the paper. Russell passed it to him, then began laying out more documents in a neat line down the center of the table, right between the turkey and the truffle potatoes. Each one was carefully labeled with sticky notes in Russell's precise handwriting. "These are Eleanor's credit card statements for the same period," Russell continued, his finger tracing down a highlighted column of numbers. "Gucci $8,000, Tiffany & Company $15,000, the country club monthly dues of $1,200, weekly spa appointments at that place on Main Street averaging $600 per visit." He looked up, making eye contact with each person around the table. "Every single one of these charges was paid by Marissa, not by Eleanor, not from Henry's estate, by Marissa, who supposedly lives in poverty and embarrasses this family with her failures." My Aunt Susan had her hand over her mouth. My cousin Emma was openly staring at my mother with something close to horror in her young eyes. Even Lydia had gone pale, her earlier smile completely vanished. "Now, Eleanor," Russell said, and his tone was almost conversational. "Would you like to tell everyone here how much money Henry left you when he died? Or should I?" My mother's hands were trembling slightly as she reached for her wineglass. "I don't have to explain my finances to anyone. What Henry left me is private between a husband and wife." $800,000. Russell interrupted, his voice cutting through her protests like a knife. "Henry's life insurance policy paid out $800,000 to you as the sole beneficiary in October 2019. I know because I helped him set up that policy 20 years ago. I was there when he signed the papers." He pulled out another set of documents, these ones stapled together in a thick stack. "These are your bank statements, Eleanor. Henry's life insurance was deposited on October 15, 2019. By December of 2020, 14 months later, you had less than $50,000 remaining. In just over a year, you spent $750,000. The whispers around the table grew louder. My Uncle Robert was shaking his head slowly, as if he couldn't quite process what he was hearing. My aunt was no longer trying to hide her shock. "That's not possible," Lydia said, her voice small and uncertain. "Mom told me she was being careful with the money that she was investing it, that—" "Your mother went on 3 European vacations in 2020, Russell said, not unkindly but firmly. "She renovated this entire house top to bottom. New kitchen, new bathrooms, new furniture in every room. She bought a new Mercedes, fully loaded $70,000. She joined 2 additional country clubs. She started collecting art." He gestured around the dining room, and I noticed for the first time the expensive paintings on the walls, the new chandelier overhead, the furniture that definitely hadn't been here the last time I visited. All of this happened in 18 months. And when the money ran out, when the credit card bills started piling up, who do you think paid them? "I didn't ask her to," my mother said, but her voice had lost all its earlier strength. "If Marissa chose to help me, that was her decision." "Help you?" Russell's voice rose slightly, the first sign of real anger breaking through his calm exterior. "Eleanor Marissa paid $47,000 in property taxes on this house over 3 years. Do you understand what that means? This house, this mansion that you use as a stage to humiliate your daughter in front of the entire family, would have been foreclosed on 2 years ago if Marissa hadn't quietly paid the taxes when you couldn't. The bank would own this house. You and Lydia would have been evicted." The word evicted seemed to hit Lydia like a physical blow. She turned to look at our mother, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Mom, is that true? Were we going to lose the house?" My mother said nothing. She just sat there, her perfectly manicured hands gripping the edge of the table, her face a mask of brittle composure that was starting to crack around the edges. Russell gathered the papers slowly, methodically, stacking them back into his folder. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, but somehow more terrible in its quietness. "Henry worked for 40 years to build something for his family. He built a successful business, he provided a beautiful home, he saved and planned and sacrificed so that his wife and daughters would be taken care of after he was gone. And you, Eleanor, you spent it all in 18 months on handbags and jewelry and vacations. And then you spent the next 3 years taking money from the daughter you call a disappointment, the daughter you mock in front of everyone, the daughter you claim embarrassed this family." He paused, letting his words sink in. "The only thing that saved you from losing everything was Marissa's kindness. And you repaid that kindness with cruelty." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't shock anymore. This was judgment. I could feel it in the way my relatives were looking at my mother, in the way even Lydia had shifted slightly away from her in her chair. Russell turned to face my mother directly, and his eyes were cold as winter. "But the credit cards and property taxes are just the beginning, Eleanor. Shall we talk about what you did to Henry's will?" The mention of my father's will sent a jolt through me that I felt in my bones. I watched Russell reach back into his briefcase, and this time he pulled out 2 documents, both carefully protected in clear plastic sleeves. He held them up side by side, and even from where I sat, I could see they looked different. Different paper, different formatting, different everything. Henry made his will in August of 2015. Russell said, placing the first document on the table with a reverence that made my throat tighten. He was 65 years old, in perfect health and of completely sound mind. He came to my office one afternoon and asked me to witness his signature. He brought another witness too, Margaret Chen, his secretary of 20 years. Neither of us had any financial stake in his estate. The will was drafted by Richard Morrison, the attorney who'd handled Henry's legal affairs for 3 decades. I found myself leaning forward, desperate to see the words on that page, even though I was too far away to read them. Russell seemed to sense this and picked up the document, reading aloud in a clear, steady voice that carried through the dining room. I, Henry Robert Cole, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. I leave the entirety of my estate, including the family home located at 1847 Riverside Drive, all savings accounts, investment portfolios, and my shares in Cole and Blake Accounting to my daughter Marissa Cole in recognition of her unwavering integrity and strength of character. Russell paused, looking around the table. To my wife Eleanor, I leave $50,000. To my daughter Lydia, I leave $50,000. The words hit me like a physical force. My father had left me everything. Not because I'd asked for it, not because I'd manipulated him, but because he'd chosen to. I felt my eyes burning with tears I'd been holding back all evening. That's ridiculous, my mother said, her voice sharp with desperation. Henry would never have cut me out like that. We were married for 37 years, which is exactly why he did it when he was healthy, Russell interrupted. He knew you, Eleanor. He knew exactly who you were. He set down the first will and picked up the second document. Now this, on the other hand, is the will that was submitted to probate court in 2019. It's dated February 1st of that year, just 2 weeks before Henry died. I watched as Russell held up the second document, and even I could see the differences. The paper was brighter, newer. The formatting was completely different. And the content, according to Russell's grim expression, told an entirely different story. This version leaves everything to Eleanor and Lydia, with Marissa receiving nothing, Russell said flatly. The witnesses listed are Lydia Cole and Eleanor's sister Patricia, who coincidentally moved to Portugal 3 years ago and hasn't returned since. He turned to my sister. Lydia, do you remember signing this document? Lydia's face had gone from pale to ashen. She shook her head slowly. I don't know. Mom had me sign some papers when Dad was in the hospital. She said they were just medical forms, power of attorney things. I didn't read them carefully. I was so worried about Dad, and she said it was urgent. Her voice cracked. Oh God, did I sign that? Did I help her? You signed something, Russell said, not unkindly. Whether it was this exact document or whether your signature was transferred somehow, I can't say for certain. But I can tell you that the signature on this will doesn't quite match your normal handwriting. A forensic document examiner would spot it immediately. My Uncle Robert was examining both documents, now holding them up to the light from the chandelier. The signatures don't match, he said quietly. Henry's signature on this second one looks close, but it's not right. The pressure is different. Some of the letter formations are off. That's because Henry was heavily medicated in February 2019, Russell said. He could barely hold a pen. He certainly wasn't in any condition to understand or sign a legal document. And here's the most telling detail. Richard Morrison, Henry's attorney of 30 years, was never contacted about this will change. Instead, Eleanor used a lawyer named David Chen, a man who'd only been practicing for 3 years, and who, according to my research, lost his license last year for ethical violations. The implications of what Russell was saying crashed over me like a wave. My mother hadn't just spent my father's money recklessly. She hadn't just lied about her finances. She had forged his will. She had literally stolen my inheritance, the final gift my father had tried to give me. "That's defamation," my mother said, but her voice was weak. "You can't prove any of this. You're just trying to cause trouble to turn my family against me." "I can prove all of it," Russell said calmly. He reached into the folder one more time and pulled out a small envelope yellowed slightly with age. "And so could Henry, which is why he gave me this 5 years ago with very specific instructions. He told me that if anything happened to him, if Eleanor tried to change his will or cut Marissa out, I was to give this to Marissa directly." He walked around the table and placed the envelope in my hands. My name was written on the front in my father's distinctive handwriting, the letters slightly shaky, but unmistakably his. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely open it. Inside was a single sheet of my father's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with his initials embossed at the top that he'd always used for important correspondence. The note was dated August 2015, the same date as the will. "Marissa," I read aloud, my voice breaking over his name for me. "If you're reading this, I'm gone. Don't trust Eleanor. She married me for money, stayed for security, and I fear she'll do anything to keep it. You deserved better than this family gave you. You were always the strongest of all of us. Build your own life on your own terms. You're worth more than you know. Love, Dad." The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. I pressed the letter to my chest, feeling the weight of my father's love in every word, the validation I'd been craving my entire life finally given to me in his own hand. Around the table, I heard sniffling. My Aunt Susan was crying openly. Even my uncle had to wipe his eyes. I looked up at my mother, and for the first time in my life, I saw her clearly. Not as the powerful matriarch who controlled our family with criticism and manipulation, but as exactly what my father had known her to be, a woman who valued money over everything, including her own daughter. "You stole my inheritance," I said, my voice steady despite the tears on my cheeks. "You stole Dad's final wishes. You forged his signature and manipulated Lydia into being your accomplice." I stood up slowly, still clutching my father's letter. "But that's not the worst thing you did, is it, Mother?" Russell's expression shifted into something I'd never seen before, a deep sadness mixed with what looked like regret. He took a breath that seemed to cost him something, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler than it had been all evening. "Marissa, there's something else you need to know. Something Henry discovered in 2010, about 9 years before he died." He paused, and I felt my heart hammering in my chest. "Your mother had an affair in 1986 with a man named Paul Anderson. He was a businessman, wealthy, ambitious. The affair lasted several months. When Eleanor became pregnant with you, she knew there was a possibility that Paul was your biological father, not Henry." The room seemed to tilt sideways. I gripped the edge of the table, my father's letter still clutched in my other hand. Around me, I heard gasps, shocked murmurs, my Aunt Susan's sharp intake of breath. "In 2010, Henry had some health concerns, and his doctor recommended genetic testing for hereditary conditions," Russell continued. "The results showed that you didn't share Henry's genetic markers. He was devastated, but not for the reason you might think." Russell's eyes met mine, and I saw tears there. "He came to my office the day he got the results. He sat in the chair across from my desk, and he said, 'Russell, I've known that girl since the day she was born. I held her when she was 5 minutes old. I taught her to ride a bike. I walked her through her first heartbreak. She's my daughter in every way that matters. I won't abandon her because of Eleanor's betrayal.' I couldn't breathe. The man I'd called Dad my entire life, the man whose love had been the one constant in my childhood, had known for 14 years that I wasn't his biological child, and he'd loved me anyway. He'd loved me enough to protect me from this truth, to keep it secret so I wouldn't feel the pain of it." "Henry never told you because he wanted to spare you," Russell said. "He knew it would hurt you, and he saw no reason to cause that pain. You were his daughter. That was all that mattered to him." He turned his gaze to my mother, and his voice hardened. "But Eleanor knew. She'd always known, and she used that knowledge to justify every cruel thing she ever said to you, every comparison to Lydia, every moment of rejection. In her mind, you weren't really her husband's child, so you didn't deserve the same treatment. My mother's face had gone completely white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Russell pulled out another stack of papers, and I recognized bank statements again, but these were different from the ones he'd shown before. Paul Anderson paid Eleanor $2,000 every single month from 1986 until 2010. That's 24 years, $480,000 in total. He spread the statements across the table like damning evidence at a trial. Eleanor told Paul the money was child support, that it was going toward your education, your clothing, your future. She sent him photos of you at school events and graduations. She made him believe he was being a responsible father from a distance supporting his biological daughter even though he couldn't publicly acknowledge you. The cruelty of it hit me like a wave. All those years of my mother telling me we couldn't afford things, that I needed to apply for scholarships, that I should be grateful for what little I had, and she'd been collecting nearly $500,000 that was supposedly for me. Did I ever see any of that money? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Not a penny, Russell confirmed. Eleanor deposited every check into a private account Henry knew nothing about. She used it for exactly what she wanted: luxury items, trips, investments in her name only. When Henry discovered the affair and the payments in 2010, he confronted Paul Anderson directly. He demanded the payments stop, and Paul complied immediately. He was terrified his wife would find out about the affair and the child. Lydia was staring at our mother with an expression of complete horror. Mom, how could you? You took money that was meant for Marissa. You've been lying to all of us for decades. My mother finally found her voice shrill and defensive. I didn't lie. The money was paid to me. I was the one who had to deal with the consequences of that affair. I was the one who had to raise a child that wasn't my husband's. You chose to stay married, Russell interrupted, his voice cutting. You chose to accept Henry's name, his money, his home, his reputation. And you chose to take Paul Anderson's money while giving Marissa nothing. You manipulated both men for your own benefit. He pulled out one final document, and I could see it was a photocopy of handwritten pages. This is from Henry's private journal entries he made in the last year of his life. He wrote, Eleanor doesn't love me. She loves what I provide. I've known this for years, but I stayed because of the girls. Now I realize she never loved them either. Lydia is a possession to her, something to show off. And Marissa, she resents Marissa for existing, for being evidence of her betrayal. The day I become inconvenient is the day I become disposable. The words hung in the air like smoke. I thought about my father writing those words, knowing he was married to a woman who saw him only as a source of money, staying anyway to protect us. And he had protected me in the only way he knew how, by loving me unconditionally, despite knowing I wasn't his blood, and by making sure his will reflected his true wishes. Russell carefully gathered his papers and placed them back in his folder. The movement seemed final, like the closing of a chapter. But when he looked up at me, I knew there was more. Paul Anderson is still alive, he said quietly. He's 73 years old now. He was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 6 months ago. The doctors gave him a year at most. Russell's voice dropped even lower. He contacted me 3 weeks ago. He wants to meet you, Marissa. He says he has information about your father's death, information that changes everything. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I found myself sitting in a booth at Murphy's Diner, a small roadside place 40 minutes outside of Cincinnati, where I was certain no one from my family would see me. My coffee had gone cold in front of me as I watched the door, my stomach churning with an anxiety I couldn't name. I was about to meet my biological father for the first time, and I had no idea what to expect or even what to feel. When Paul Anderson walked through the door, I recognized him immediately from the photos Russell had shown me, though time and illness had clearly taken their toll. He was 73 years old but looked older, his frame thin beneath an expensive coat that now hung loose on his shoulders. His face was gaunt, his skin had a grayish pallor, and his hands trembled slightly as he made his way to my booth. He carried a worn leather briefcase that looked like it had seen decades of use. "Marissa," he said, and his voice cracked on my name. He stood beside the booth as if unsure whether he had permission to sit. "Thank you for agreeing to see me. I know I have absolutely no right to be here. I know I failed you for 38 years. He lowered himself into the seat across from me with the careful movements of someone in chronic pain. "I was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer 8 months ago. The doctors were optimistic at first, said I might have a year, maybe more, with treatment. But I can feel it spreading. I don't think I have 6 months left." His eyes, when they met mine, were filled with a desperate sincerity. "I needed to see you once before I die. I needed to tell you the truth." A waitress came by and Paul ordered coffee with shaking hands. I noticed he didn't order food. When she left, he opened the briefcase and began pulling out documents with the methodical care of someone who'd organized this presentation many times in his mind. "I want you to understand something first," he said, spreading bank statements across the table between us. "When I met your mother at a charity gala in 1986, I was 30 years old and stupidly ambitious. She was beautiful and charming, and she told me her marriage to Henry was loveless, that he was cold and distant. I believed her because I wanted to believe her." He looked down at his hands. "The affair lasted 4 months. When she told me she was pregnant, I was terrified. I had just gotten married myself. My career was taking off. Eleanor said she would handle everything, that she'd stay with Henry and raise you, but that I needed to support you financially." He pointed to the first bank statement dated December 1986. $2,000 a month for 24 years. I have records of every single payment, $480,000. His voice was growing stronger now, fueled by what looked like long-suppressed anger. "Eleanor sent me photos of you over the years. You at your kindergarten graduation, you at science fairs, you playing soccer. She'd write little notes, 'Marissa needs new school clothes,' or 'Marissa's college fund needs a boost.' She made me believe that money was going to you, that I was being a responsible father, even if I couldn't be there in person." I stared at the statements, at the neat rows of numbers that represented decades of payments. "I never saw any of it," I said quietly. "She told me we couldn't afford things. She made me work 3 jobs to pay for community college." Paul's face crumpled. "I didn't know. God help me, I didn't know. I thought you were thriving. I thought I was helping you build a future." He pulled out a stack of photos, and I recognized myself at various ages smiling at the camera in what I now realized were carefully staged shots my mother had taken. "She sent these with her letters. 'Marissa is doing so well thanks to your support,' she'd write. She's such a bright girl." I believed every word. His voice broke completely. "If I had known she was pocketing that money while treating you like you were worthless, if I had known what your life was really like, I would have—" He couldn't finish the sentence, overcome with emotion. We sat in silence for a moment while Paul composed himself. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, grown darker and more urgent. "There's something else. Something that's been eating at me for years." He pulled out a different folder, this one containing what looked like insurance documents. "In 2018, 2 years ago, Eleanor contacted me. We hadn't spoken since 2010 when Henry confronted me and the payments stopped. She said she needed one final favor, $25,000 for an investment opportunity. I told her no at first. I was done with her manipulations. But she threatened to tell my wife about the affair, about you. She said she'd destroy my marriage and my reputation." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I gave her the money. I wired it to her account and told myself it was the last time, that I'd never hear from her again." He slid a document across the table toward me. 3 months later, I was at her house dropping off some paperwork she'd asked for. She stepped out of the room to take a phone call, and I saw these papers on her desk." His hand was shaking badly now. It was an application for a $2 million life insurance policy on Henry's life. The down payment was $25,000, the exact amount I'd given her. My blood ran cold. She used your money to buy life insurance on my father. When I confronted her about it, she laughed. Actually laughed. She said it was just smart financial planning that Henry was getting older and she needed to secure her future. She made it sound so reasonable, so normal. Paul's eyes locked on mine. Henry Cole died 14 months later, Marissa. Barely long enough to avoid the insurance company's scrutiny. And Eleanor collected $2 million. The diner seemed to fade away. I heard the clatter of dishes, the murmur of other conversations, but it all felt distant and unreal. Paul reached across the table, not quite touching my hand, but close enough that I could feel the tremor in his fingers. His voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. There's something else Eleanor did with my money. Something that involves your father's death. I've been gathering evidence, asking questions, and I think... He stopped, took a breath. I think Eleanor murdered Henry, and I'm terrified that I might have helped her do it. Paul reached into his briefcase one more time and pulled out a photocopy of what looked like an official insurance document. His hands were shaking so badly now that the papers rattled as he placed them in front of me. This is a copy of the life insurance application. I shouldn't have it, but after Henry died and I started having suspicions, I called in some favors. I still have connections in the financial industry. I pulled the document closer, scanning the pages. The policy was from Midwestern Life Insurance, dated October 2018. Eleanor Cole was listed as both the policy owner and sole beneficiary. The face value was $2 million. My eyes caught on the medical declaration section, where someone had checked boxes indicating that Henry Robert Cole was in excellent health, with no pre-existing conditions, no current medications, and no history of heart disease. That's not possible, I said, my finger hovering over those check marks. Dad had his first heart attack in 2016. He was on medication. He'd been seeing a cardiologist regularly for 2 years by the time this was filed. Exactly, Paul said, his voice tight. The application is fraudulent, but look at the signature at the bottom. He pointed to a line where my father's name was signed in what looked like his handwriting, but something about it seemed off. The letters were formed correctly, but the flow was wrong, too hesitant, like someone had been copying rather than writing naturally. I'm not a handwriting expert, but I've seen Henry's signature on dozens of business documents over the years. This doesn't look quite right to me. I thought about the forged will Russell had shown us at Thanksgiving, how my mother had managed to create a false document with my father's signature. She'd done it before. She could have done it again. Insurance companies must verify these things, right? They must have questioned a $2 million policy on a man with known heart problems. They should have, Paul agreed. But here's the thing about insurance fraud: if you're careful and you know what you're doing, it's easier than people think. Eleanor submitted this application through a broker, someone who probably never met Henry in person. She likely forged the signature and bet that the company wouldn't do extensive medical record checks until after a claim was filed. And even if they did check, she timed it perfectly. He pulled out another page showing the policy effective date and the date of Henry's death. Most life insurance policies have what's called a contestability period the first 2 years after the policy is issued. During that time, if the insured person dies, the company can investigate the application for fraud and deny the claim if they find misrepresentations. After 2 years, it's much harder to contest. I did the math in my head. Dad died in February 2019. This policy was issued in October 2018. That's only 14 months. Exactly. If Eleanor had waited 6 more months until after the 2-year mark, it would have looked even more suspicious. But 14 months is long enough that it doesn't immediately raise red flags while still being within the window where insurance companies typically process claims quickly, especially if the cause of death seems straightforward. Paul leaned back in the booth, looking exhausted. I've been obsessing over this timeline for 2 years. I keep thinking if I hadn't given her that money, if I had refused or reported her to the insurance company, would Henry still be alive? That evening, I called Russell from my apartment. I'd been staring at the insurance documents for hours, my mind spinning with implications I didn't want to accept. When I told him what Paul had shared, There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "I need to show you something," Russell finally said. "Can you come to my house tomorrow morning?" The next day, sitting in Russell's study surrounded by my father's belongings that he'd been keeping safe, I learned just how suspicious Eleanor's behavior had been in the months following Dad's death. Russell pulled out a timeline he'd apparently been maintaining dates and observations written in his precise handwriting. "I attended Henry's funeral in February 2019, Russell said, pointing to the first entry. Eleanor stood at the front of the church in a black designer suit. She didn't cry once, Marissa. Not during the service, not at the burial, not at the reception afterward. She was composed, almost businesslike. I remember thinking it was shock that she was holding herself together for the family." He moved his finger down the page. "3 days after the funeral, I stopped by the house to drop off some of Henry's business documents. Eleanor was meeting with an interior designer planning a complete renovation. She was picking out new furniture, new paint colors. The man she'd been married to for 37 years had been in the ground for 72 hours. I felt sick listening to this, picturing my mother redecorating while the rest of us were still grieving. Russell continued, his voice growing harder. "By May, 3 months after Henry died, she'd bought a Mercedes S-Class, $70,000 paid in cash. In June, she joined 2 additional country clubs. In July, she went to Paris for 3 weeks, staying at 5-star hotels. In August, the renovation was complete: new kitchen, all new furniture, a pool added to the backyard. I started keeping track because something felt wrong." He showed me bank statements he'd obtained through his role as executor of my father's business affairs. The life insurance paid out $2 million in April 2019. Henry's personal accounts held another $800,000. That's $2.8 million. By December 2020, 20 months later, she had less than $50,000 left. "How is that even possible?" I asked, though I was starting to understand exactly how my mother operated. "Because Eleanor doesn't just spend money, she burns through it," Russell said. "And here's what really bothers me. She was spending like someone who knew exactly how much she'd have and when she'd have it, like she'd been planning this windfall for a long time." He pulled out another document, this one a death certificate. "Your father died at Ohio Valley Hospital on February 12, 2019 at 2:47 in the morning. Cause of death: acute heart failure. The attending physician was Dr. Richard Morrison." The name meant nothing to me. Was that Dad's regular doctor? No, his cardiologist was Dr. Patricia Chen. She'd been treating him for 3 years. But that night, Morrison was on duty. Russell's expression darkened. "Here's what doesn't make sense. I visited Henry the afternoon before he died. He was stable, sitting up joking with the nurses. They told me he'd be discharged within a few days. His vitals were good. He was recovering well from the episode that had brought him in." Russell's voice dropped. Then at 2:47 in the morning, his heart just stopped. The nurses tried to revive him but couldn't. Morrison pronounced him dead and signed off on the death certificate listing natural causes. No autopsy was performed because there was no reason to suspect anything other than the progression of his existing heart condition. My voice came out barely above a whisper. "Are you saying, Mom? Are you saying she murdered Dad?" Russell met my eyes, and I saw the same terrible certainty I was beginning to feel. "I'm saying we need to find Dr. Richard Morrison. And we need to find the nurse who was on duty that night." Russell gave me the name of a private investigator he'd worked with on business matters over the years, a retired police detective named Calvin Moore, who now took on private cases. I met with Calvin in his small office above a hardware store, and within 10 minutes of explaining what we suspected, he was taking notes and asking questions about the night my father died. He promised to be discreet and thorough, and I left his office feeling like I'd set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. A week later, Calvin called me. "I found the nurse who was on duty the night your father died. Her name is Sarah Collins. She's 52 years old and currently working at a hospital in Cleveland about 3 hours from here. When I contacted her initially, she refused to talk. But when I mentioned it was Henry Cole's daughter who wanted to speak with her, she went quiet for a long time. Then she said she'd meet with you, but only in person and only somewhere private." We arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in a town halfway between Cleveland and Cincinnati, a neutral location where neither of us would be recognized. I arrived early and sat in a corner booth, my hands wrapped around a cup of tea I couldn't drink because my stomach was too knotted with anxiety. When Sarah Collins walked in, I recognized her immediately from the photo Calvin had shown me, though she looked older than her years, with deep lines around her eyes and a weariness in the way she carried herself. She slid into the booth across from me and ordered coffee from the waitress with hands that trembled slightly. When we were alone, she looked at me with eyes that were already filling with tears. "I've been carrying this guilt for 5 years," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I knew something was wrong that night. I've known ever since. But I was too afraid to speak up, too afraid of what it would mean for my career, for my family." She wrapped both hands around her coffee mug as if trying to draw warmth from it. "When your investigator said you were looking into your father's death, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. Your father deserved better than what happened to him." I felt my heart pounding as I leaned forward. "Tell me what happened that night, please." Sarah took a deep breath and began to speak, and as she did, I could see she was back in that hospital room reliving every moment. "February 12, 2019. I was assigned to the cardiac unit that night, and your father was one of my patients. He'd been admitted earlier that week with what we thought was a minor heart episode, but he'd stabilized beautifully. His vitals were strong, he was alert and talkative, joking with me about the hospital food. He showed me photos of you and your sister on his phone. He was so proud of you both." Her voice caught. "He was supposed to go home in a few days. Everyone on the floor knew it. He was doing that well." "What changed?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. At 11 o'clock that night, Dr. Richard Morrison showed up to do rounds. That was unusual right there because Morrison wasn't your father's primary physician, and he almost never worked the night shift. I remember being surprised to see him. Sarah's hands tightened around her mug. "He went into your father's room, stayed for maybe 5 minutes, then came out and wrote an order in the chart. He told me to administer a specific cardiac medication at double the normal dosage. I looked at the order and immediately questioned it. I said, 'Doctor, this dosage seems very high for his current condition and weight. Are you certain this is correct?' What did he say?" I prompted when she fell silent. He got angry. His whole demeanor changed. He stepped closer to me and said, "I'm the doctor here, not you. I know what I'm doing. Administer the medication exactly as ordered, or I'll have you written up for insubordination and have your license reviewed for questioning a physician's judgment." Sarah's voice had started to shake. I was terrified. I was a single mother with 2 kids in college. I couldn't afford to lose my job or my license. So I did what he ordered. I gave your father that medication at 11:30, and I documented it in his chart. I felt cold all over. And then what happened? For the first hour, everything seemed fine. Your father was sleeping peacefully. His monitors were stable. But around 2 in the morning, his heart rate started becoming irregular. By 2:30, the alarms were going off. I called for the code team, but it happened so fast. At 2:47, he went into full cardiac arrest. We tried everything CPR, the defibrillator, emergency medications, but nothing worked. Dr. Morrison pronounced him dead at 3:14. Tears were streaming down Sarah's face now. I knew in my gut that the medication had caused it, that the dosage had been wrong, but Morrison was standing right there acting like it was just a tragic outcome of his existing condition. He signed the death certificate and made it all seem so routine. "Why didn't you report it?" I asked, trying to keep the accusation out of my voice. "I was going to. I swear to God, I was going to go to the hospital administration the next day." But 2 days later, Dr. Morrison called me into his private office. He had an envelope sitting on his desk, and when I sat down, he slid it across to me. Inside was $10,000 in cash and a reference letter for a nursing position at Cleveland Memorial Hospital. He looked me right in the eyes and said, "You're an excellent nurse, Sarah. Sometimes patients die despite our best efforts, and there's nothing anyone could have done to prevent it. I trust you understand that. Take this opportunity for a fresh start somewhere new." It wasn't a gift. It was a threat. He was telling me to take the money, leave town, and keep my mouth shut or else. And you took it, I said softly. I took it, she admitted, shame thick in her voice. I moved to Cleveland, started the new job, and I've spent every day since then knowing I let a good man's death go uninvestigated because I was a coward. She reached into her bag and pulled out a manila folder, sliding it across the table to me with trembling hands. But I saved everything. I made copies of the medication orders, the dosage records, my nursing notes from that night, the timeline of events. I kept the envelope Morrison gave me with his fingerprints still on it. I documented everything because some part of me knew that one day the truth would need to come out. Her eyes met mine, filled with desperate remorse. Dr. Morrison killed your father, and I helped him do it. I'm so sorry. With Sarah's evidence in hand and Calvin Moore's help, Russell and I tracked down Dr. Richard Morrison's current address within 2 days. He'd retired from Ohio Valley Hospital in early 2020, barely a year after my father's death, and had moved to a modest apartment building in Cleveland, a stark contrast from the upscale medical plaza where he'd practiced for decades. Calvin had discovered that Morrison's wife had filed for divorce shortly after his retirement, and his medical license had lapsed without renewal. Whatever life he'd been living before had clearly fallen apart. Russell and I drove to Cleveland on a gray Saturday morning. The apartment building was in a neighborhood that had seen better days, with peeling paint on the exterior and a parking lot full of potholes. We climbed to the 3rd floor and stood outside apartment 3F, and I could feel my heart hammering as Russell knocked on the door. Footsteps approached, then stopped. Who is it? The voice was rough, suspicious. Dr. Morrison, my name is Marissa Cole. Henry Cole was my father. I need to talk to you about the night he died. There was a long silence, then the sound of a chain being removed. The door opened just wide enough for me to see a man who looked far older than his 61 years. His face was unshaven, his eyes bloodshot, and he reeked of alcohol even though it was only 10 in the morning. I have nothing to say to you. Leave me alone. He tried to close the door, but Russell put his foot in the gap. Eleanor Cole used you, I said quickly, desperately. She threw you away just like she did to everyone else, but we can stop her from getting away with it. Please, just give me 5 minutes. Morrison stared at me through the crack in the door, and I saw something flicker in his eyes, pain maybe, or recognition. Then he slammed the door shut. Russell and I stood there for a moment, deflated, before I pulled out a piece of paper and pen from my bag. I wrote quickly, Eleanor betrayed you too. She used you and threw you away just like she did to everyone else. Let's talk. I slid it under the door and we left. An hour later, as Russell and I sat in a diner trying to figure out our next move, my phone rang from an unknown number. Morrison's voice was hoarse and defeated. Edgewater Park, the bench near the Western Pier. 1 hour. Come alone or I won't show. I went alone despite Russell's protests, finding Morrison sitting on a weathered bench overlooking Lake Erie. He had a flask in his hand and looked even worse in the daylight. His hands shook as he unscrewed the cap and took a drink. I loved her, he said without preamble, not looking at me. God help me, I actually loved Eleanor. The affair started in 2016 when your father first got sick and started coming to the hospital regularly. She was there every day playing the devoted wife, and she'd stop by my office to ask questions about his condition, his prognosis. She was beautiful and attentive, and she made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. He finally turned to look at me, and his eyes were hollow. My marriage had been dead for a decade. My work was just routine. Then Eleanor walked into my life, and suddenly everything had color again. When did it become physical? I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. That summer. We started meeting at hotels, having dinners in restaurants far from anyone who might know us. She told me her marriage to Henry was a prison, that he was cold and controlling, that she'd stayed all those years for financial security, but she was dying inside. Morrison's voice was thick with self-loathing. She painted herself as this tragic figure trapped in a loveless marriage, and I believed every word because I wanted to believe it. She said once Henry was gone, we'd be together. We'd take the life insurance money, move to Florida, buy a house on the beach, and finally be free. I felt sick listening to how completely my mother had manipulated this man. "When did she ask you to kill him?" She never asked directly at first. She was too smart for that. She'd ask questions about his medications, about how different drugs affected heart conditions, about what could cause cardiac arrest. She was so curious, so engaged, asking me to explain everything in detail. I thought she just wanted to understand her husband's illness. He took another drink from his flask. Then in late 2018, she started making suggestions. What if his dosage was increased? What would happen if he took too much of his beta blocker? She'd ask these questions in this casual, hypothetical way, like we were just having intellectual conversations. But looking back, she was testing me, seeing how far I'd go. "And you went all the way," I said, unable to keep the edge from my voice. Morrison nodded, tears now running down his face. She showed me the insurance policy in January 2019, $2 million. She said it was our future, our escape. She'd even been practicing forging Henry's signature, showing me her work like it was a game we were playing together. By then, I was so deep into the affair, so convinced we had a future, that I couldn't see what she really was. He pulled out his phone, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. On February 12th, she texted me at 10 p.m. It said, "Tonight. He's stable enough that no one will suspect, but weak enough that it will work." I knew exactly what she meant. I went to the hospital, ordered the medication at double dosage, and I made sure that nurse was too scared to question me again. "And then my father died," I whispered. "And then your father died." Eleanor collected her $2 million in April. For the first few weeks, we still saw each other, still made plans. But then she started being unavailable, canceling our meetings, not returning my calls. By June, she'd blocked my number entirely. When I went to her house, she threatened to call the police. She told me she'd recorded some of our conversations, and if I ever contacted her again, she'd send them to the authorities and make sure I went to prison for murder while she played the grieving widow. Morrison's voice broke completely. She used me and destroyed me, and I was too stupid to see it coming. He fumbled with his phone, pulling up an audio file. "Before she cut me off completely, I recorded one of our conversations. It was March 2019, about a month after your father died. You need to hear this. It's proof she planned everything." Morrison's recording was damning Eleanor's voice, clear and cold, as she talked about how poor Henry never knew what hit him, and discussed waiting for the insurance check to clear. But as I listened to it sitting in Russell's study the next day, something else nagged at me. My father had been sick for years before he died, deteriorating slowly in a way that had seemed like the natural progression of heart disease. What if the night Morrison killed him wasn't the beginning? What if it was just the end? I called Calvin Moore and asked him for another recommendation, this time for a forensic toxicologist. He gave me the name of Dr. Rebecca Lynn, a specialist who'd testified in several high-profile murder cases. When I met with her and explained what we suspected, she listened carefully, taking notes, and then asked the question I'd been dreading. "Do you have any preserved biological samples from your father's hair nails? Anything that might contain a record of what was in his system before he died?" I turned to Russell, feeling hopeless. My father had been cremated. There was no body to exhumed, no tissue samples taken during his brief time in the hospital before death. But Russell's face had gone thoughtful, and he stood up and walked to a bookshelf in his study. He pulled down a small wooden box I'd never noticed before and opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a lock of gray hair tied with a black ribbon. "I took this at the funeral," Russell said quietly, almost apologetically. "It seemed morbid, but I wanted something of Henry's to keep. I never imagined it would matter like this." Dr. Lynn's eyes lit up when she saw it. "Hair is perfect. It grows about 1/2 inch per month, and it preserves a timeline of whatever substances were in the bloodstream. If your father was exposed to any toxins in the 2 years before his death, this hair will tell us." A week later, Dr. Lynn called me with results that made my blood run cold. "Marissa, I need you to sit down for this." Her voice was gentle but grave. Your father didn't just die from the medication overdose on February 12th. He was being systematically poisoned for approximately 2 years before that night. The hair sample shows steadily increasing levels of arsenic starting in early 2017 and continuing right up until his death in 2019. I couldn't speak. The room seemed to tilt around me. Arsenic poisoning at low doses is insidious, Dr. Lin continued. The symptoms mimic cardiovascular disease almost perfectly. Chronic fatigue, muscle weakness, irregular heartbeat, difficulty breathing, chest pain. In a patient who already had a history of heart problems, every doctor would naturally attribute these symptoms to the progression of cardiac disease. There would be no reason to test for poisoning unless someone specifically suspected it, and why would they in what appeared to be a devoted marriage? So his doctors were treating his heart. I said, my voice barely functioning, while she was poisoning him at home. Exactly. And the arsenic would have genuinely weakened his heart over time, making the final overdose Morrison administered both easier to execute and less likely to raise suspicions. The death looked like the natural culmination of a 2-year decline. Dr. Lin's voice softened even more. Marissa, I'm so sorry, but your father suffered for 2 years. Every day he felt worse, and every day she was the one causing it. This wasn't a quick mercy killing. This was prolonged torture. Calvin's investigation turned up more evidence that painted an even darker picture. He found receipts from Morrison's hardware dating back to March 2017, showing Eleanor had purchased industrial-strength rat poison containing arsenic trioxide. The receipt noted she'd told the clerk they had a serious rodent problem in their old house. She'd purchased the same product again in August 2017, January 2018, and November 2018 4 times over 2 years, which was far more than any household would need for legitimate pest control. Even more damning, Calvin obtained a warrant to search Eleanor's computer history. Buried in her browsing data from 2017 were searches for arsenic poisoning symptoms. How much arsenic is lethal? How long does arsenic stay in human body? And can arsenic be detected after death? She hadn't just been poisoning my father. She'd been researching how to do it effectively, how to avoid detection, how to make it look like natural illness. When I showed Russell all of this evidence spread across his dining room table, he sat down heavily and put his head in his hands. He told me something once about a year before he died. We were having lunch and he said, "Russell, I feel like I'm being eaten alive from the inside. The doctors keep adjusting my medications, but nothing helps. I'm just getting weaker every day." I told him it was the heart disease, that it was a progressive condition. I thought he was being metaphorical. Russell looked up at me with anguish in his eyes. He was being literal. He knew something was wrong with his body, something the doctors weren't catching, and I dismissed it. "You couldn't have known," I said, but my own voice was shaking. I stared at the toxicology report at the graph showing the arsenic levels climbing month after month in my father's system, and felt a rage so pure and cold it seemed to clarify everything. She tortured him for 2 years. She watched him suffer every single day, watched him grow weaker and more confused, and she pretended to care. She played the devoted wife while she was slowly killing him. Russell's jaw tightened, and he reached for his phone. "There's more. After we got the toxicology results, I called in a favor with someone at the prosecutor's office. They executed a search warrant on Eleanor's house this morning. They found something in the basement hidden in a locked file cabinet. Something that proves she was planning this from the very beginning." The search warrant was executed on a Tuesday morning while my mother was at her weekly spa appointment. Russell called me from the house, his voice tight with barely controlled anger, and told me to come immediately. When I arrived, police officers were carrying boxes of evidence out the front door while neighbors gathered on the sidewalk to watch. I found Russell in the basement, standing in front of a door I'd never noticed before, partially hidden behind an old armoire that had been moved aside. "None of us knew this room existed," Russell said as he led me inside. "Your mother had the only key, kept it on her personal keyring. The police had to get a locksmith." The room was small, maybe 10 by 12 feet, with no windows and fluorescent lighting that buzzed overhead. File cabinets lined 2 walls and a desk sat against the third with a computer that looked several years old. Detective Calvin Moore was photographing everything methodically, and he nodded at me as I entered. "Your mother kept meticulous records," Calvin said, gesturing to the open file cabinets. "We've found love letters from Paul Anderson dating back to 1986, including ones where he explicitly mentions the monthly payments. Letters from Dr. Morrison starting in 2016 getting progressively more intimate and eventually discussing your father's health in detail. She even kept a ledger documenting every dollar she received from both men over the years like she was running a business." He pulled out a leather-bound notebook and showed me pages filled with my mother's precise handwriting listing dates, amounts, and notes like PA, monthly, and RM, bonus. "She was keeping insurance," Russell said grimly. "Blackmail material in case either man tried to stop paying or expose her." But it was the folder Calvin showed me next that made my hands start shaking. It was labeled Contingency in my mother's handwriting, and had been hidden in the back of the bottom drawer of her desk underneath a false bottom that the police had only discovered because they'd measured the drawer and realized it was shallower than it should be. Inside were documents that took my breath away. Draft emails printed out on paper formatted to look like they'd come from an old email account I'd abandoned years ago when I changed jobs. The messages were addressed to no one, just dated and saved as if they were real correspondence. "I wish Dad would just die already, so I could finally get what's mine." One read. Another said, "How much longer do we have to wait for the old man to go? Mom says he's getting worse, but it's not happening fast enough." There were diary entries, too. Pages that looked like they'd been torn from a journal written in handwriting that was eerily similar to mine, but not quite right. The content was damning complaints about my father controlling all the money fantasies, about what I'd do with my inheritance, resentment toward both my parents. Mom called again begging for money. Dad controls everything and won't give her access. If he would just die, I could get my inheritance and finally be free of this family. "She practiced your handwriting," Calvin said quietly. "We found the practice pages, too, where she was copying samples of your signature and writing style. And this," he held up an evidence bag containing an empty prescription bottle with a pharmacy label. "That's the same medication Morrison ordered the night your father died. Your fingerprints are on this bottle, Marissa. We tested it. She must have taken something you touched years ago, maybe a glass or a mug, and transferred your prints onto this." I felt sick. She was going to frame me for Dad's murder. "If the investigation had ever pointed toward her, yes," Calvin confirmed. "She'd plant these documents, discover them, and suddenly the evidence would point to you instead. The resentful daughter who needed money, who had means and motive. With your prints on the medication bottle and these forged communications, you might have actually been charged." "Why didn't she use it?" I asked, though I was starting to understand. "Because she didn't need to," Russell answered. "When Henry died, everyone accepted it as natural causes. There was no investigation, no suspicion. By the time you started asking questions months later, it was too late for her to plant this evidence effectively. You had alibis, you lived in Columbus, had work records showing you were nowhere near Cincinnati during your father's final weeks. Dozens of people could account for your whereabouts." Calvin closed the folder carefully. "If she'd planted this before your father died, it might have worked. But she kept it as insurance, thinking she'd have time to execute the plan if she ever needed to. Instead, it proves premeditation and malicious intent. She wasn't just planning to kill your father. She was planning to destroy your life completely if anyone got too close to the truth." Detective Moore gathered all the evidence and looked at me with sympathy mixed with professional determination. "We have everything we need for an arrest warrant now. The 2-year poisoning Morrison's testimony and recording the insurance fraud, the forged will, and now this attempted frame, Mrs. Cole. Are you ready to see your mother arrested for murder?" I thought about my father suffering for 2 years, about Morrison's manipulation, about Sarah's fear, about every cruel word my mother had ever said to me. My voice when I spoke was steady and clear. "I'm ready. But first, I want her to confess publicly. I want everyone who ever believed her lies to hear the truth from her own mouth. Detective Moore Russell and I spent an entire afternoon planning exactly how to get my mother's confession on record in a way that would be legally admissible and publicly undeniable. Moore explained that a confession obtained through deception could be challenged in court, but if Eleanor knew she was being recorded and confessed anyway, it would be ironclad. The question was how to get her comfortable enough to incriminate herself while still maintaining that legal requirement. The answer came to me late that night, appealed to her ego and her belief that she'd already won. I called my mother the next morning, keeping my voice humble and defeated. "Mom, I've had some time to think about everything that happened at Thanksgiving. I was angry and I said things I shouldn't have. I'd like to have dinner with you and Lydia, just the three of us, and try to work through this as a family." There was a pause on the other end, and I could practically hear her calculating. "I want to understand your side of things. No Russell, no drama, just us trying to heal." Eleanor's voice, when she responded, had that familiar condescending warmth she used when she thought she was winning. "Of course, sweetheart. I've been hoping you'd come to your senses. Family is everything, and we need to move past this ugliness. When were you thinking?" We settled on Friday evening at my apartment. After I hung up, I called Lydia separately. She was hesitant, caught between loyalty to our mother and the growing horror of what she'd learned at Thanksgiving. "Please, Lydia," I said. "I need you there. This is about all of us." She finally agreed, though her voice was filled with uncertainty. I spent the next 3 days preparing my apartment like I was staging a theater production. I borrowed a high-quality camera from a colleague and positioned it on a bookshelf with a clear view of my dining table, hiding it behind a stack of books with just the lens peeking through. I set up my laptop on the kitchen counter at an angle that would capture the table, and I tested the audio quality obsessively to make sure every word would be clear. The piece de resistance was logging into the Oak Hills Community Church Facebook group, where my mother had been an active member for over a decade, constantly posting inspirational quotes and photos of family gatherings with captions about blessings and faith. I set up the live stream feature to activate from my laptop, positioning it so the camera would capture the dining table perfectly. I wrote a simple caption, "Family dinner tonight, hoping for healing and understanding." To anyone watching, it would look like an accidental stream left on the kind of technical mistake people make all the time. I knew that on a Friday evening, dozens of church members would be scrolling through their feeds, and the moment anything interesting happened, word would spread like wildfire. Friday arrived, and I cooked a simple meal: roasted chicken vegetables, a salad, nothing extravagant, but respectable. I wanted it to look like I'd made an effort, like I genuinely cared about reconciliation. When Eleanor and Lydia arrived, I greeted them warmly, and as we sat down, I gestured to the visible recording device on my phone propped against a water pitcher. "I just want to mention that I'm recording our conversation tonight for my own records, so we're all clear about what's said, and there are no misunderstandings later. Is that all right?" Eleanor barely glanced at it, waving her hand dismissively as she settled into her chair. "Record whatever you want, Marissa. I have nothing to hide. I think this conversation will be good for all of us." What she didn't see was my laptop across the room, its camera light covered with a tiny piece of tape already streaming to an audience that was just beginning to notice. I started slowly asking Lydia about her children, complimenting Eleanor on her necklace, pouring wine, and playing the role of the dutiful daughter seeking peace. As we ate, I gradually shifted the conversation, each question carefully designed to move us closer to the truth. "Mom, I've been thinking a lot about Dad lately. About his last wishes. I'm trying to understand what happened with his will." Eleanor took a sip of wine, and I saw her shoulders relax. She thought she was in control, thought this was her chance to bring her wayward daughter back in line. "Your father made a lot of decisions when he was emotional, and not thinking clearly. The important thing is that we're family and we take care of each other. But his original will from 2015 left everything to me." I pressed gently, watching her face. "Russell showed us the document. Why did Dad change his mind?" Eleanor's expression flickered with annoyance, but she was emboldened by the wine and what she perceived as my submission. She leaned back in her chair, glass in hand, and smiled with cold satisfaction. "Your father was a fool, Marissa. He didn't understand how the world really works. That money was always mine. I earned it by putting up with him for 30 years. I kept my face carefully neutral, as my mother's words hung in the air, even as my heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I needed her to keep talking, to dig herself deeper. "But Mom," I said softly, pouring her more wine with a hand that I willed to stay steady. "Dad loved you. You were married for 37 years. Why would he only leave you $50,000? Eleanor laughed, and the sound was bitter and ugly. "Love your father didn't love anyone but you, Marissa. You, the affair baby, the one who wasn't even his blood. He loved you more than he ever loved Lydia, his actual daughter." She gestured dismissively toward Lydia, who had gone very still in her chair. "He was going to leave everything to you because you were honest and had integrity. As if those things pay the bills or maintain a lifestyle. Well, I wasn't going to let that happen. I spent 30 years building that life, maintaining that house, playing the perfect wife for his business associates and his boring friends. That money was mine. I earned every penny." "So you changed the will," I said, keeping my voice calm and curious rather than accusatory. Eleanor's eyes flashed with something like pride. "I did what I had to do. He was dying anyway. I just made sure the paperwork reflected reality instead of his sentimental foolishness." I leaned forward slightly as if trying to understand. "But Dad wasn't just dying on his own, was he? Russell said he was getting better that week. The doctors told him he might have years left." My mother's face twisted with anger, the wine and her own arrogance making her reckless. Years. Years of what exactly? Years of him having time to change his will back. Years of him deciding to leave me with nothing after I gave him my entire life. I wasn't going to sit around and hope he stayed sick long enough for nature to take its course. Lydia made a small sound, something between a gasp and a whimper, her hand covering her mouth. I kept my eyes on my mother. "What did you do, Mom?" Eleanor was too far gone now to stop the words spilling out of her like poison finally released. "I made sure he didn't recover. Richard Morrison helped me. He was so easy to manipulate, so desperate to believe I loved him. Your father went to sleep that night thinking he'd be home in a few days, thinking he'd get to go back to his boring little life. He never woke up." She took another drink of wine, her voice dropping to something almost conversational. "It was better that way, really. Quick and painless. Better than the long, drawn-out death he would have had anyway with his heart condition. I did him a favor if you think about it." The confession was complete. Every word had been captured. I glanced at my phone on the table, its screen showing the view count on the live stream climbing past 350. That's when Lydia noticed the laptop across the room. Her face, already pale, went completely white as she saw the Facebook interface on the screen, the comment section exploding with messages, the viewer count updating in real time. "Mom," Lydia said, her voice rising with panic. "Mom, what's that? Is that—" She stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "Mom, we're live! Oh my God, we're streaming on Facebook!" "The whole church is watching this." Eleanor's expression transformed in an instant from smug satisfaction to pure animal terror. She lurched toward the laptop, but I was faster, closing it with a calm click. The damage was done. I knew church members were already recording the stream on their phones, taking screenshots, sharing the video. Within minutes, it would be everywhere, backed up on dozens of devices, impossible to erase. "You set me up," Eleanor whispered, her whole body beginning to shake. "You planned this. You manipulated me." I looked at my mother, this woman who had spent 38 years making me feel worthless, who had poisoned my father for 2 years, who had murdered him in his hospital bed and then stolen everything he'd tried to give me, and I felt nothing but cold, clear purpose. "No, Mother. I gave you every opportunity to tell the truth tonight. I told you I was recording. You said you had nothing to hide. You chose to confess. You chose to brag about killing Dad and stealing from me. I just made sure everyone heard it." Eleanor collapsed back into her chair, hyperventilating, her perfectly made-up face crumpling. Lydia was crying silently, staring at our mother like she was seeing a stranger. My phone began buzzing with calls and messages. Then came the pounding on my apartment door, urgent and insistent. I opened it to find Pastor John from our church, his face stricken, and behind him at least a dozen church members who must have rushed over the moment they saw the live stream. And behind them, exactly as Detective Moore had promised when we planned this, were two uniformed police officers, with Moore himself bringing up the rear. Moore stepped forward, his face professionally neutral, but his eyes meeting mine with something like respect. "Eleanor Cole, you're under arrest for the murder of Henry Cole. You have the right to remain silent." My phone didn't stop buzzing for the rest of the night. By the time the police led my mother out of my apartment in handcuffs, the live stream had been shared over 500 times. I watched in real time as the video spread across Facebook, then jumped to Twitter, then to local community forums. Screenshots of my mother's confession, her face twisted with arrogance as she said, "I made sure he didn't recover," were being posted everywhere with captions like, "Ohio socialite confesses to murder on Facebook Live," and "You won't believe what this woman just admitted to." Within an hour, local news stations had picked up the story. Channel 5 ran a breaking news banner, "Prominent Cincinnati woman arrested after viral confession." Channel 9 was already outside my apartment building with cameras. My phone showed notifications from friends I hadn't spoken to in years, from former colleagues, from people I'd gone to high school with, all sending messages of shock and support. Pastor John stayed after the police left, sitting on my couch with his head in his hands. "I've known your family for 15 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Eleanor taught Sunday school. She organized the Christmas fundraiser. She stood up in church and talked about the sanctity of marriage and family values." He looked up at me with tears in his eyes. How did we not see it? How did we not know? The church Facebook group had exploded with over 1,000 comments. I scrolled through them with numb fingers. I can't believe this is real. That poor man. "Marissa, we are so sorry we didn't see what you were going through. Eleanor fooled all of us." The support was overwhelming and unexpected, coming from a community that had watched my mother humiliate me for years and said nothing. Eleanor was taken to the hospital that night after hyperventilating so badly in the police car that the officers called paramedics. The doctors determined it was a panic attack brought on by stress. Not a heart attack, but they kept her overnight for observation, with a police officer stationed outside her room. I heard all this from Detective Moore, who called to update me and to warn me that reporters would likely be trying to reach me for comment. The arraignment happened the following afternoon. I sat in the courtroom with Russell and Lydia, watching as my mother was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of her usual designer clothes. She looked smaller, somehow, diminished without her jewelry and her carefully styled hair. The prosecutor stood and argued that Eleanor was a flight risk given the severity of the charges: first-degree murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and the fact that she still had access to substantial funds from my father's estate. This defendant meticulously planned and executed her husband's murder over a period of 2 years, Your Honor. She forged legal documents, manipulated medical professionals, and attempted to frame her own daughter. She has the means and the motivation to flee. Eleanor's attorney, an expensive defense lawyer she'd somehow retained within hours of her arrest, argued that she had deep ties to the community and nowhere to run. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, set bail at $2 million, the exact amount Eleanor had collected from my father's life insurance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Eleanor's sister, Margaret, wired the money from Portugal, and my mother was released with an ankle monitor and strict conditions: no contact with family members, no contact with witnesses, and she was forbidden from leaving Ohio. What I didn't expect was the outpouring of support that followed. Women I'd never met reached out through social media, through email, through messages passed along by mutual acquaintances. "My mother was like yours," one woman wrote. "She made me feel worthless my entire life. Thank you for showing me I wasn't crazy, that it was abuse. Another message read, I've been in an abusive marriage for 18 years. Watching you stand up to your mother gave me the courage to finally leave. The messages came from across Ohio, then from neighboring states, then from across the country as the video continued to spread. Local domestic violence organizations contacted me asking if I'd be willing to speak at events about family abuse and financial manipulation. A reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer wanted to do a feature story. The attention was overwhelming and sometimes frightening, but underneath it all, I felt something I'd never experienced before: validation. For 38 years, I'd believed I was the problem. Now hundreds of people were telling me they understood that what I'd experienced was real and wrong and not my fault. Lydia moved into my spare bedroom the day after the arrest. She sat on my couch that first night and broke down completely. "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I knew Mom was cruel to you. I saw it and I did nothing. I laughed along with her jokes because I was terrified that if I didn't, she'd turn on me too. I was a coward, and you suffered because of it." I held my sister while she cried, feeling decades of resentment and hurt beginning to crack and shift into something that might eventually become forgiveness. "You were a victim too," I told her, "just in a different way." 1 week later, Russell called me with an urgency in his voice that made my stomach drop. "Detective Moore just contacted me. They executed another search warrant on Eleanor's house. They found something else in the basement, something that makes this case even worse. He wants us at the station immediately." Russell and I arrived at the police station within an hour of Detective Moore's call. He led us to a conference room where dozens of evidence photos were spread across the table, each one marked with yellow tags and case numbers. My stomach knotted as I recognized the basement of my childhood home in the images. "We got a second warrant after your mother made bail," Moore explained, pulling out a folder of photographs. "We wanted to be thorough, make sure we hadn't missed anything. That's when we found this." He pointed to a photo showing a door I'd never seen before tucked into a corner of the basement behind what used to be my father's old workbench. "No one in the family knew this room existed. Your mother had the only key and she'd kept it hidden in a locked jewelry box in her bedroom. We had to bring in a locksmith." May. The photos showed a small windowless office, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, with industrial shelving lining the walls and a metal desk pushed against the back. File cabinets stood open, their contents carefully documented by crime scene photographers. Moore spread several images in front of us. "Your mother kept meticulous records of everything. We found love letters from Paul Anderson dating back to 1986, organized chronologically in labeled folders. Letters from Dr. Morrison starting in 2016, getting progressively more intimate and eventually discussing your father's medical condition in explicit detail." Russell leaned forward, examining the photos more closely. "She was documenting her own crimes. More like keeping insurance," Moore said. "We found a ledger where she tracked every payment she received from both men over the decades. Dates, amounts, notes about what she told them the money was for versus what she actually spent it on. She was building leverage, keeping evidence she could use against them if they ever tried to stop paying or expose her." My hands felt cold as I processed this. My mother hadn't just been manipulating these men, she'd been systematically documenting their vulnerability, creating a paper trail she could weaponize if needed. It was calculating in a way that made my skin crawl. Then Moore pulled out another set of photos, these ones showing a manila folder with the word contingency written across the tab in my mother's handwriting. "This is what I really needed you to see. We found this hidden in a false bottom of her desk drawer." He opened the folder, carefully revealing its contents. "These are forged documents designed to frame you for your father's murder if the investigation ever pointed toward her." I stared at the evidence photos in disbelief. There were printed emails formatted to look like they'd come from an old email address I'd used briefly after college, messages I'd never written saying things like, "I wish Dad would just die so I could finally get what's mine," and "How much longer until the old man is gone?" There were pages torn from what appeared to be a journal written in handwriting that looked eerily similar to mine, filled with complaints about my father controlling the family finances and fantasies about what I'd do once I inherited his money. "She practiced your handwriting," Moore said quietly. "We found the practice pages too, where she was copying samples of your signature. And this." He pulled out another evidence bag. "This is an empty container that held arsenic trioxide, the same substance found in your father's system. Your fingerprints are on it." My voice came out as barely a whisper. "How is that possible? I never touched anything like that." "We think she transferred your prints from something else you'd handled years ago, probably when you still lived at home. A glass, a mug, something with a smooth surface she could lift the print from." Moore's expression was grave. "If she'd executed this plan and planted these documents before your father died, you would have been the primary suspect. With your prints on the poison container and these forged communications, you likely would have been charged with murder." Russell's face had gone pale. "Why didn't she use it?" "Because she didn't need to," I said, the realization dawning slowly. "When Dad died, everyone accepted it as natural causes. There was no investigation. By the time I started asking questions months later, it was too late for her to plant this evidence. I had alibis. I was living in Columbus with documented work records." "Exactly," Moore confirmed. "She kept this as insurance, probably thinking she'd have time to deploy it if suspicion ever turned toward her. Instead, it proves premeditation and shows she was willing to destroy your life completely to protect herself. We're adding additional charges of conspiracy, to commit fraud, and attempted obstruction of justice." Among all the evidence photos, Moore pulled out one more image that made my breath catch. It showed a sealed envelope yellowed slightly with age, with my name written across the front in my father's handwriting. "We found this in the same drawer as the contingency folder. It's dated February 5th, 2019, 1 week before your father died. Your mother intercepted it and hid it. She never intended for you to see it." Moore handed me the actual envelope, now preserved in a clear evidence bag. "You should open this in private," he said gently. "We've already documented it for evidence purposes. It's yours now." Back at my apartment with Russell and Lydia, both sitting quietly beside me, I carefully broke the seal with trembling fingers. The envelope contained a single sheet of my father's personal stationery, the cream-colored paper with his initials at the top. The handwriting was shaky, but legible, the words of a man who knew he was dying but wanted to make sure the truth was heard. "My dearest Marissa," I read aloud, my voice breaking over the familiar greeting. "If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I'm certain Eleanor is to blame." Tears blurred my vision as I continued reading. "I know she's planning to kill me. I've seen the insurance papers she tried to hide. I've heard her late-night phone calls with Morrison when she thought I was asleep. But I'm too weak to fight anymore, and the cancer would take me in a few months anyway. What matters now is that you know the truth about who you are and who I chose you to be." My hands shook as I continued reading my father's letter aloud, each word feeling like a gift I'd been waiting my entire life to receive. "I discovered you weren't my biological daughter in 2010. It didn't matter then, and it doesn't matter now. From the moment you were born, you were mine, not by blood, but by choice. You have integrity. Eleanor will never understand. She sees love as weakness and control as strength. You see love as a gift freely given. That's why I'm leaving everything to you. Not because Lydia doesn't deserve support, but because you'll know what to do with it. You'll use it wisely, share it generously, and build something meaningful." I had to stop reading for a moment, pressing the letter against my chest as sobs racked through me. Russell put a gentle hand on my shoulder while Lydia cried quietly beside me. When I could breathe again, I continued. "Eleanor is planning something. I can feel it. She's too attentive lately, asking about my medications, discussing my will meeting privately with Morrison. I'm leaving evidence with Russell. Trust him. He's been a brother to me in ways blood never could have made him." The next paragraph made my throat tighten even more. "Don't let Eleanor rewrite history. Don't let her paint me as a fool or herself as a victim. I knew exactly who I married and I made my peace with it years ago. My only regret is that I couldn't protect you from her cruelty the way I wanted to. Build your own family, Marissa One, based on love, not obligation. Forgive your mother if you can. I never could. But more importantly, forgive yourself for not being enough in her eyes. You were always more than enough in mine. The letter ended with words that broke me completely. I am proud to have been your father, not by accident of biology, but by the conscious choice I made every single day to love you. That choice was the best decision of my life. Love always, Dad. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. For 38 years, I'd believed I was unworthy of love, that there was something fundamentally broken in me that made my mother incapable of caring. But my father had known the truth all along. He'd known I wasn't his biological child, and had chosen me anyway, had loved me more fiercely because of it, had tried even from beyond the grave to make sure I understood my worth. Russell's voice was thick with emotion when he finally spoke. Henry made me promise something before he died. He made me swear that if anything happened to him, I'd make sure you knew you were loved. Not because you earned it or deserved it, but because you were his daughter in every way that mattered. Lydia reached over and took my hand, squeezing it tightly. We sat like that for several minutes, the three of us connected by grief and love, and the memory of a man who had been better than any of us had fully appreciated while he was alive. When the immediate wave of emotion finally subsided enough for me to think clearly, Russell shifted in his seat with obvious discomfort. Marissa, Lydia, there's something else I need to tell you. Something that came up during the DNA testing we did to confirm Paul Anderson was Marissa's biological father. Lydia looked up, her face still wet with tears. What do you mean? Russell took a deep breath, and I could see how much he didn't want to deliver this news. We ran a standard family comparison as part of the paternity test. It's routine in these situations. The results showed that Marissa shares no genetic markers with Henry, which we expected. But they also showed that Lydia... He paused, meeting my sister's eyes with profound sympathy. Lydia, you don't share genetic markers with Henry either. You're not his biological daughter. The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible and yet undeniable. Lydia's face went from confusion to comprehension to devastation in the space of seconds. What? No, that's not possible. I'm the real daughter. I'm the one who was supposed to be his. Mom always said. Eleanor had another affair in 1989, Russell said gently. Around the time you were conceived. Based on the timeline and some investigation, we believe your biological father was likely a man named Carlos Mendez, someone who worked briefly for the family that year. Eleanor kept it hidden, just like she kept Marissa's paternity hidden. Lydia was shaking her head, tears flowing freely now. But Mom treated me so differently. She loved me. She chose me. If I wasn't Dad's either, then why? Because you looked like Henry, I said softly, the pieces suddenly falling into place. Blonde hair, blue eyes. I looked like Paul Anderson, dark hair, different features. You could pass as Henry's daughter. I couldn't. That's why she kept you close and pushed me away. Russell nodded. Eleanor found out through a private DNA test in 2015, the same year Henry made his will. She discovered that neither of you were biologically his. That's when her control over you intensified, Lydia. She was terrified that if you learned the truth, you'd leave her just like she feared Marissa would. You were her proof to the world that she was a devoted mother. She couldn't lose that. Lydia looked at me with devastation in her eyes. We're both, neither of us. I took both of her hands in mine, holding tight. We're both Dad's daughters, not by blood, but by his choice to love us. He knew the truth about both of us, and he loved us anyway. He chose us every single day. Lydia collapsed against me, sobbing, and I held my sister the way I'd wanted someone to hold me for 38 years. Russell sat with us, this man who had been more family to us than our own mother had ever been. And for the first time since my father died, I felt like we might actually survive this. Russell's phone rang, breaking the moment. He looked at the screen and his expression grew serious. "It's Detective Moore." He answered, listened for a moment, then met my eyes. "The district attorney is ready. They're filing formal charges tomorrow morning. Eleanor will be charged with first-degree murder, insurance fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. This is really happening." The days after learning about Lydia's paternity felt surreal, like we'd both been living in a house of mirrors our entire lives, and someone had finally turned on the lights. Lydia stayed in my spare bedroom, and we spent hours talking late into the night in ways we never had as children. She told me things I'd never known, painful memories she'd kept hidden beneath the veneer of being the golden child. "Mom would weigh me every single morning," Lydia said one night, curled up on my couch with a mug of tea. "I had to step on the scale before breakfast, and she'd write the number in a little notebook. If I gained even a pound, she'd lock the kitchen cabinets and give me these pills she said were vitamins, but I think were appetite suppressants. I was hungry all the time, but I learned to never say anything because that would disappoint her." I stared at my sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. "I always thought you had it so easy. I thought she loved you." "She didn't love me," Lydia said, and her voice broke. "She was managing me like I was a PR problem she needed to contain. She chose all my clothes, told me which friends I could have picked, my college major, because communications is perfect for a girl like you. I thought that meant she cared, that all that attention meant I was special. But it was just control. She was terrified of losing control." I shared my own memories, then the ones I'd carried alone for so long. The casual cruelties, the public humiliations, the way Eleanor's face would twist with disgust when she looked at me. "I used to think there was something wrong with me," I said. "That if I could just be better, smarter, prettier, she'd finally love me. But nothing was ever enough." "Because we were never the problem," Lydia said, reaching for my hand. She was. Russell came by the next afternoon and found us sitting together, and something in his expression softened when he saw how close we'd become. He sat down across from us and tried to explain the psychology of what our mother had done. "Eleanor didn't treat you better because she loved you more, Lydia. She treated you better because you looked like Henry. Blonde hair, blue eyes, delicate features. You could pass as his biological daughter. Marissa looked like Paul Anderson, darker coloring, stronger features. She was a constant reminder of Eleanor's betrayal, so Eleanor pushed her away. But when Mom found out in 2015 that I wasn't Dad's either," Lydia said, slowly working through it, "she should have treated me the same as Marissa. Why did she get worse instead?" "Because she panicked," Russell explained. "She'd just discovered that Henry knew about Marissa's paternity and had made a will leaving everything to her. Then Eleanor found out you weren't his biological daughter either, which meant both her daughters were evidence of her affairs. She doubled down on controlling you because if you ever found out the truth and left her, her entire facade as a devoted mother would crumble. You were her proof to the world that she was respectable." The realization settled over me like a weight. Lydia and I had both been prisoners, just in different cells. She'd been controlled through false love and manipulation, while I'd been punished through rejection and cruelty. And through it all, our father had known the truth about both of us, and had loved us anyway, had chosen us deliberately and completely. 2 days later, we met with Detective Moore and the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh, who reviewed the charges being filed against our mother. She spread documents across the conference table as she spoke. First-degree murder for Henry's death on February 12th. Aggravated murder with torture for the 2 years of arsenic poisoning. Insurance fraud for the $2 million policy. Forgery for the falsified will. Witness tampering for bribing Sarah Collins. And conspiracy to commit fraud for the attempted frame of Marissa. "Will she be convicted?" Lydia asked, her voice small. Walsh's expression was confident. "With the viral video confession, Dr. Morrison's testimony and recording the toxicology evidence, and Sarah Collins's account, this is one of the strongest cases I've prosecuted in 20 years. Your mother will likely be convicted on all counts." She paused, her expression gentler. I need to warn you both, the trial will be difficult. Eleanor's defense attorney will try to paint her as mentally ill as someone who was manipulated by Morrison. They'll try to discredit both of you, suggest you're motivated by greed or revenge. It won't be easy to sit through. I don't care, I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I want the truth on record. I want everyone to know what she did. That evening, Russell called to tell us to turn on the news. Every local station was showing the same footage: police cars lined up outside my childhood home, officers approaching the front door with an arrest warrant. My mother appeared moments later dressed immaculately in a cream-colored suit with her hair and makeup perfect, as if she'd been expecting the cameras. She walked toward the police car with her head high, and just before they helped her into the back seat, she turned and looked directly into the nearest camera. Her voice was clear and cold enough to cut through the chaos of shouting reporters. "My daughters will regret this," she said, her eyes boring into the lens. "I'm their mother. They'll never be free of me." The formal arraignment took place 2 days after my mother's arrest in a courthouse packed with reporters, curious onlookers, and members of our church who'd come to witness the woman they thought they knew face justice. Lydia and I sat in the front row with Russell watching as Eleanor was led in wearing an orange jumpsuit that seemed to diminish her, somehow stripping away the armor of designer clothes and expensive jewelry she'd always hidden behind. Her attorney, Martin Shepard, was a high-priced criminal defense lawyer from Cleveland with a reputation for getting wealthy clients acquitted. He stood before the judge and entered a plea of not guilty on all counts, then launched into an argument that made my blood boil. "Your Honor, my client is a pillar of this community. She's been an active church member for decades, has deep family ties, and owns property in the area. She is not a flight risk. Furthermore, the so-called confession that's been circulating online was taken completely out of context. Mrs. Cole was a grieving widow who said hurtful things in a moment of anger and emotional distress, manipulated by a daughter who has a clear financial motive to discredit her." Prosecutor Walsh stood, her voice sharp and clear. "Your Honor, the defendant is facing life in prison for first-degree murder among other serious charges. We have toxicology evidence showing she poisoned her husband for 2 years. We have testimony from Dr. Richard Morrison detailing their conspiracy to murder Henry Cole. We have a forged will and evidence she attempted to frame her own daughter. This defendant has substantial financial resources and every reason to flee. The state requests bail be set at $5 million or denied entirely." The judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s, reviewed the case file for what felt like an eternity before setting bail at $2 million with strict conditions, including an ankle monitor and surrender of her passport. Eleanor's sister, Margaret, who apparently still had family loyalty despite living in California, wired the money within hours. My mother walked out of the courthouse that afternoon, and despite the ankle monitor hidden beneath her slacks, she managed to project an air of wounded dignity as she faced the cameras. "I loved my husband deeply," she said, her voice trembling in a performance I recognized from years of watching her manipulate people. "I would never hurt him. My daughter has turned our family tragedy into a witch hunt because she's bitter about how her life turned out. The truth will come out at trial, and I will be vindicated." Dr. Morrison's arrest happened the same week, but his approach was entirely different. He turned himself in voluntarily, accompanied by his attorney, looking like a man who'd already accepted his fate. He'd been cooperating with prosecutors for weeks, and the evidence he'd provided was damning, not just for my mother, but for himself. Detective Moore told me Morrison had handed over everything: recorded phone conversations with Eleanor love letters, where they discussed making my father's death look natural, text messages coordinating the timing of the fatal overdose. The plea deal was announced at a brief hearing I attended with Russell. Morrison would plead guilty to second-degree murder, instead of first-degree, receiving 25 years to life, with eligibility for parole after 25 years. As part of the agreement, he would testify fully and truthfully at Eleanor's trial. Unlike my mother, Morrison was denied bail entirely and was immediately remanded to county jail to await sentencing. His attorney read a prepared statement outside the courthouse. Dr. Morrison was manipulated by Eleanor Cole, a woman he loved and trusted. He takes full responsibility for his role in Henry Cole's death and deeply regrets his actions. While Eleanor and Morrison faced criminal charges, Paul Anderson's reckoning came in different forms. The IRS launched an investigation into the $480,000 he'd paid Eleanor over 2 decades, payments that should have been reported and taxed as gifts. The penalties and back taxes exceeded $200,000, and Paul's accountants scrambled to negotiate a settlement. His wife Carol, who'd known nothing about the affair or about me, filed for divorce within a week of the story breaking. The local business journals ran articles about his secret double life, and Paul resigned from every board position. He held his reputation in ruins. His cancer progressed rapidly during this period, as if the stress had accelerated what was already inevitable. When he was moved to hospice care, weak and clearly dying, he called me one final time. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "Marissa, I don't expect forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that watching you fight for justice, watching you refuse to let Eleanor destroy you, it's been the proudest moment of my life. You're stronger than I ever was. You're everything I should have been." I found myself crying for this man I barely knew, this flawed, broken person who'd been as much a victim of my mother's manipulation as anyone else. "Thank you for telling the truth," I said. "That took courage." "Too little, too late," he replied. "But it's something." 3 weeks later, Paul Anderson died. His attorney, a kind-faced woman named Patricia Chen, contacted me the day after his death. "Ms. Cole, Mr. Anderson left very specific instructions regarding his estate. There's something he wanted you to have, evidence he's been collecting for 14 years, documents and recordings he kept as insurance. And there's a trust fund, approximately $500,000, that can only be accessed once Eleanor Cole is convicted of a felony. He wanted to make sure you had the resources to see this through to the end." Patricia Chen's law office was in a modest building downtown, nothing like the prestigious firms my father had worked with. She greeted me warmly when I arrived, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "Thank you for coming, Ms. Cole. I know this is a difficult time, and Paul's death adds another layer of complexity to everything you're dealing with." She opened a file folder and pulled out several documents, spreading them carefully across her desk. Paul was very specific about his final wishes. After his divorce settlement with Carol and the IRS penalties, his remaining estate totals approximately $500,000. He's placed all of it in an irrevocable trust with you as the sole beneficiary. I stared at the numbers on the page, struggling to process what she was saying. "I don't understand. Why would he leave me anything? He was barely part of my life." Patricia's expression was compassionate. "He felt tremendous guilt about that. But there's a condition attached to the trust." She pointed to a clause highlighted in yellow. "The funds can only be released to you after Eleanor Cole is convicted of a felony related to Henry Cole's death. Paul wanted to ensure you had financial resources to see this legal battle through to the end. He knew Eleanor would hire expensive attorneys and drag this out as long as possible, and he didn't want you to be outmatched because of money. But the practicality of it was so typically male, so focused on logistics rather than emotion, and yet there was something touching about Paul trying to help from beyond the grave in the only way he knew how." Patricia continued, "There's also a provision that any unused funds after your needs are met will go toward establishing the Henry Cole Memorial Scholarship for children of incarcerated parents. Paul wanted to honor the man who raised you, even though he couldn't be that man himself." She reached for another envelope, this one sealed with wax. "But the trust fund isn't the most important thing Paul left you. This is." She slid it across the desk. "He called it his insurance policy. He's been collecting evidence about Eleanor for 14 years, ever since Henry discovered the affair in 2010. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten letter, but Patricia held up her hand. "Before you read the letter, you need to hear what's on this recording," Paul made it in 2010, and he believed it was the most damning evidence against Eleanor. She plugged the drive into her computer and pulled up an audio file dated October 2010. Paul's voice came through the speakers, younger and stronger than the dying man I'd spoken with weeks ago. Eleanor Henry knows everything. He knows about the affair about Marissa being my daughter. We need to come clean, tell him the full truth. He deserves that much. My mother's voice responded, and hearing it made my skin crawl. Absolutely not. Are you insane? Henry is useful to me, Paul. He has old money, an old family name, social standing in this community. I'm not giving that up because you suddenly grew a conscience. But what happens when he dies? Paul's voice was strained, desperate. He could cut you out of his will entirely now that he knows. You could end up with nothing. There was a pause, and then my mother laughed. Actually laughed. When Henry dies, I'll inherit everything. His current will leaves everything to me and the girls. Well, to his girls anyway. Eleanor, he's talking about changing that will. He told me himself. What if he leaves everything to Marissa out of spite? Another pause, longer this time, and when my mother spoke again, her voice was cold and calculating. Then I'll make sure he doesn't live long enough to do that. I've thought about this, Paul. I've thought about it quite a lot, actually. The recording continued for another few minutes, with Paul trying to backtrack, trying to convince himself she was joking, but the damage was done. That single statement, recorded 9 years before my father's death, proved Eleanor had been planning to kill him if he ever threatened her financial security. Patricia stopped the playback and looked at me with serious eyes. This recording proves premeditation going back over a decade. It shows Eleanor had both motive and intent years before the actual murder took place. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe. My mother had been planning my father's death since 2010, waiting for the right opportunity, the right circumstances. All those years of her playing the devoted wife while he got sicker, all those times she sat by his hospital bed holding his hand, she'd been waiting for him to die, or planning how to make it happen. Patricia handed me the handwritten letter, and I recognized Paul's shaky writing from his final days. Marissa, it began. I was not a brave man. I was not a good father. I let fear control my choices for 38 years. But I spent the last 14 years watching Eleanor from a distance, collecting evidence because I knew she was dangerous, and I knew she would eventually hurt Henry. I was too much of a coward to stop her while I was alive, but I can give you the weapons to fight her now that I'm gone. The letter continued. This recording proves Eleanor planned Henry's murder years in advance. Use it. Get justice for Henry. And please forgive yourself for the father you never had. The failure was mine, not yours. I may not have raised you, but I am proud of the woman you became despite me, not because of me. It was signed simply, Paul. I left Patricia's office with the USB drive and letter clutched in my hand and drove straight to Prosecutor Walsh's office. She listened to the recording 3 times, her expression growing more satisfied with each replay. When it finished, she sat back in her chair and smiled grimly. This changes everything. Eleanor's defense was going to argue that Morrison manipulated her, that the murder was his idea, and she was a victim of his influence. But this recording from 2010 proves she was planning to kill Henry years before she even met Morrison. This is premeditation going back over a decade. Walsh looked at me directly. Eleanor's defense just collapsed. We're ready for trial. The months between my mother's arrest and the trial date felt both impossibly long and terrifyingly short. Prosecutor Walsh worked around the clock, building what she called the most thoroughly documented murder case of her career. She scheduled regular meetings with Russell, Lydia, and me to walk us through the evidence as it came together, preparing us for what the trial would look like and feel like. Forensic document examiners from the state crime lab spent weeks analyzing the forged will, comparing the signatures on the 2019 document against known samples of my father's handwriting from the 2015 will and various business documents. They prepared detailed reports showing inconsistencies in pressure stroke patterns and the natural flow of writing that proved beyond doubt that someone had forged my father's signature. The toxicology reports on the arsenic poisoning were equally meticulous, with charts and graphs showing the steady increase of poison in my father's system over 2 years based on the analysis of his hair. Sarah Collins met with Walsh repeatedly, going over her testimony about that final night until every detail was clear and unshakable. Dr. Morrison, now incarcerated and awaiting his own sentencing, rehearsed his account of the affair and the conspiracy, his voice growing steadier each time, as if telling the truth was beginning to give him some measure of peace. Financial experts created presentations showing Eleanor's spending patterns after my father's death, the insurance fraud, and the meticulous way she'd hidden money in various accounts. Digital forensics specialists recovered Eleanor's deleted browser history, showing searches for arsenic poisoning symptoms and undetectable poisons, along with the files containing her attempts to frame me. The viral Facebook confession video was professionally authenticated by multiple experts who verified it hadn't been edited or manipulated in any way. "This is the most documented murder case I've ever prosecuted," Walsh told us in early April. "Your mother would need a miracle to avoid conviction on every single count." While Walsh built her case, Lydia and I built something too, a relationship we'd never really had as children. She stayed in my spare bedroom, and slowly the apartment that had been my solitary refuge became a home we shared. Lydia started seeing a therapist twice a week to work through what she was beginning to understand as decades of covert abuse and control. In March, she got her first job at a small bookstore near my apartment, and I'll never forget the look on her face when she came home after her first day. "I loved it," she said, almost surprised by her own words. "Mom always told me I was too delicate, too beautiful to work, that it was beneath me. But I helped customers find books and organized shelves, and I felt useful. I felt strong." She was making minimum wage and working part-time, but the pride in her voice was unmistakable. I helped her open a bank account in her name, only something she'd never had before. We sat together at my kitchen table working through a budget, and she cried when she realized she could make her own financial decisions without asking permission or fearing consequences. We talked for hours about our childhood, sharing memories and slowly piecing together how deliberately our mother had pitted us against each other. "She'd tell me you were jealous of me," Lydia said one night. "And she'd probably tell you I was arrogant and spoiled. She made sure we could never be allies." "We're allies now," I said, and she squeezed my hand. In March, Lydia asked if I'd come to one of her therapy sessions with her. Sitting in that quiet office with sunlight streaming through the windows, she looked at me and said the words I'd been waiting to hear my entire life. "Marissa, I was complicit in your abuse. I laughed at Mom's cruel jokes about you. I stood by while she destroyed your self-worth because I was too scared to stand up for you. I'm so sorry. I know sorry isn't enough, but I'm so deeply sorry." I took her hand and held it tight. "You were surviving the only way you knew how. You were a victim too. I forgive you." As spring arrived, the media attention intensified. I was interviewed by local news stations, then CNN, then Good Morning America. My story had struck a nerve with thousands of women who reached out through email and social media to share their own experiences with narcissistic mothers, financial abuse, and family scapegoating. A domestic violence organization in Cincinnati asked me to speak at their annual fundraiser, and I stood before 200 people and told them about recognizing abuse even when it comes from family, even when it doesn't leave physical scars. Lydia joined me at another event in April, speaking publicly for the first time about her own experience. "I was the golden child," she told the audience, her voice shaking but clear. "Everyone thought I had it easy. But I was abused too, just in a different way. My mother controlled every aspect of my life through money and manipulation. She made me dependent on her approval for everything. Abuse doesn't always look like what we expect it to look like." The standing ovation we received brought tears to both our eyes, and afterward dozens of women approached us to share their stories, to thank us for giving them permission to name what they'd experienced. 1 week before the trial was scheduled to begin in May 2025, Walsh called me with tension in her voice. "Eleanor's attorney just filed an emergency motion. She's changing her plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. They're claiming she was mentally ill and not responsible for her actions. The judge is hearing arguments tomorrow morning." The judge denied Eleanor's insanity plea after a brief hearing, where 3 independent psychiatrists testified that while she showed signs of narcissistic personality disorder, she was fully competent and understood the difference between right and wrong. The trial began on schedule in early June 2025, and from the moment I walked into that packed courtroom, I felt the weight of everything we'd been building toward for the past 7 months. Eleanor entered wearing a navy blue suit that looked modest and expensive. At the same time, her hair pulled back in a simple style that made her look older and more vulnerable than I'd ever seen her. She'd clearly been coached by her attorney on how to present herself the wronged widow, the misunderstood mother, the victim of circumstances beyond her control. She kept a box of tissues on the defense table and dabbed at her eyes periodically, though I never saw actual tears. Martin Shepard opened with a defense strategy that made my stomach turn. He painted my mother as a woman who'd suffered through years of a loveless marriage, who'd been emotionally neglected by a cold and controlling husband, who'd sought comfort in the arms of Dr. Morrison only to be manipulated and coerced into actions she never would have taken on her own. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice dripping with sympathy. My client was in a deeply vulnerable state. She was depressed, isolated, and desperate for human connection. Dr. Morrison, a man in a position of authority and trust, took advantage of that vulnerability. He convinced her that her husband needed to die, that it would be a mercy that they could be together if she just did this one terrible thing. Eleanor Cole is not a murderer. She's a victim of a master manipulator. He tried to explain away the Facebook confession as the words of a grieving widow who'd had too much wine and was being deliberately provoked by a daughter with a financial axe to grind. He suggested that Morrison was lying to reduce his own sentence, that the evidence had been taken out of context, that Eleanor had been set up by people who wanted to destroy her. Prosecutor Walsh dismantled this narrative piece by piece over the next 2 weeks. She played Paul's recording from 2010, letting the jury hear Eleanor coldly calculating about making sure Henry didn't live long enough to change his will. She presented the toxicology evidence showing 2 years of deliberate poisoning the forged will, with its obvious inconsistencies, the insurance fraud that netted Eleanor $2 million. Each piece of evidence was presented methodically, professionally, building an overwhelming case that left no room for doubt. Dr. Morrison took the stand for 2 full days, looking gaunt and broken in his prison jumpsuit. He read Eleanor's text messages aloud to the jury, his voice flat with shame. "It needs to be done this week. We've waited long enough." Another message. "He's stable now, which means they might discharge him soon. We can't let that happen." Morrison described the affair, the manipulation, Eleanor's careful research into medications and dosages. He admitted his guilt without reservation and made it clear that while Eleanor had seduced him, she had orchestrated every detail of the murder itself. Sarah Collins testified about the night my father died, describing the unusual medication order and Morrison's aggressive insistence that she follow it without question. She told the jury about the $10,000 bribe and the threat disguised as a gift. Her hands shook as she spoke, but her testimony was clear and damning. Russell presented the financial evidence showing the jury exactly how Eleanor had spent nearly $3 million in 18 months on luxury items, renovations, and vacations, while my father's body was barely cold in the ground. The contrast between her claims of grief and mental instability versus her actual behavior was stark and undeniable. Dr. Lin, the forensic toxicologist, explained the arsenic poisoning in terms anyone could understand, using charts and timelines to show how Eleanor had systematically tortured my father for 2 years. "This was not a single impulsive act," Dr. Lin told the jury. "This was sustained, intentional poisoning designed to weaken Mr. Cole gradually so that his eventual death would appear natural. This was torture." Through it all, Eleanor maintained her mask of sorrowful dignity, occasionally wiping at her eyes, shaking her head sadly as if she couldn't believe what lies were being told about her. but I could see the calculation behind her eyes the way she was performing for the jury. Then Prosecutor Walsh called Lydia to the stand, and I felt the entire courtroom lean forward with interest. Many people had assumed Lydia would support our mother. After all, she'd been the golden child, the favorite. Eleanor seemed to think so too, because she actually smiled slightly when Lydia was sworn in, as if this would finally be the testimony that saved her. Walsh established that Lydia had been granted immunity from prosecution, then asked her first question. "Miss Cole, can you describe your relationship with your mother?" Lydia looked directly at Eleanor, and I saw my sister's hands trembling even from where I sat. "My mother is a monster." The courtroom exploded into gasps and murmurs. Eleanor's face went white, then red. The judge called for order as Lydia continued, tears now streaming down her face. "Everyone thinks I was the favorite child, that I had it easy. But I was a prisoner. My mother controlled every single aspect of my life: what I wore, what I ate, who I was allowed to talk to, where I could go. If I gained 2 pounds, she'd lock the kitchen cabinets and give me pills to suppress my appetite. If I talked to a boy she didn't approve of, she'd threaten to cut me off financially and leave me with nothing. I was 35 years old and still terrified to make a decision without her permission." Walsh let that sink in before asking her next question. "Lydia, did your mother ever ask you to do anything involving your father's care?" Lydia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The worst thing she ever made me do was poison Dad." The word guilty echoed through the courtroom 6 times, once for each charge, and with each repetition, I felt something inside me shift and settle. Murder in the 1st degree. Guilty. Aggravated murder with torture. Guilty. Insurance fraud. Guilty. Forgery. Guilty. Witness tampering. Guilty. Conspiracy to commit fraud. Guilty. Eleanor sat perfectly still through all of it, her face blank, as if she'd disconnected from reality entirely, as if she genuinely could not process that she had lost. Her attorney was on his feet immediately, his voice urgent, as he requested a mistrial based on Lydia's testimony being unduly prejudicial and inflammatory. The judge looked at him with something close to contempt and denied the motion with a single sentence. "The testimony was relevant material and properly admitted. Motion denied." He thanked the jury for their service and scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks from today, then nodded to the bailiff. As Eleanor was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her bail revoked the moment the verdict was read, she turned and looked directly at me. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't quite hear over the noise of the courtroom, but I saw them clearly enough. "This isn't over." The look in her eyes was cold and empty, and despite everything, despite the victory we'd just won, a chill ran down my spine. Outside the courthouse, we were immediately swarmed by reporters shouting questions, cameras flashing, microphones thrust in our faces. Lydia pressed close to my side, and Russell put a protective hand on my shoulder. I'd prepared a brief statement with Prosecutor Walsh's help, and I delivered it as calmly as I could manage despite my shaking hands. Today, justice was served for Henry Cole, a good man who deserved so much better than what he got. This verdict sends a clear message that no one is above the law, no matter how much money they have, how respectable they appear, or how well they've hidden their crimes. My father suffered for 2 years at the hands of someone who was supposed to love him, and today a jury of 12 citizens said that suffering will not go unanswered. The 2 weeks between conviction and sentencing felt like being suspended in time. Prosecutor Walsh explained that Ohio law allowed family members to deliver victim impact statements before the judge handed down the sentence, and she encouraged all 3 of us to prepare something. "This is your chance to speak directly to the judge and to Eleanor about how her actions affected your lives," Walsh said. "The judge will consider these statements when determining the sentence, though given the severity and number of convictions, we're recommending life without possibility of parole, plus consecutive sentences on the fraud charges." I worked with my therapist to craft my statement, writing and rewriting it dozens of times. I wanted to be strong and clear, wanted to make my father proud, wanted to speak for the girl I'd been who spent 38 years believing she was worthless. I practiced delivering it in front of the mirror until I could get through it without my voice breaking, until I could say the words with the dignity they deserved. Lydia practiced her statement too, and I heard her through the apartment walls late at night, her voice growing stronger each time. She was finding her voice for the first time in her life, learning to speak her truth without fear of consequences. Russell worked on his own statement in the quiet of his study, writing about 40 years of friendship with a man who'd been more brother than business partner, about watching Eleanor systematically destroy everything Henry had built. During those 2 weeks, Eleanor somehow managed to give an interview to a journalist from a small conservative news outlet who seemed sympathetic to her story. The interview aired on a local cable channel and was immediately picked up online. Sitting in jail wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hair unstyled and her face bare of makeup, Eleanor looked directly into the camera and claimed victimhood one more time. "My daughters have been brainwashed by Henry's business partner," she said, her voice trembling with what was meant to sound like emotion. "Russell Blake has manipulated them against me because he wants control of what should have been my inheritance. I loved my husband. Yes, I made mistakes in my marriage, but what mother hasn't made mistakes? The jury was prejudiced against me from the very beginning because of that Facebook video, which was heavily edited and taken completely out of context. I never meant those things I said. I was drunk and grieving, and my daughter was deliberately provoking me." The interview backfired more spectacularly than I could have imagined. Social media exploded with outrage. Domestic violence advocates held vigils outside the jail with signs reading, "Justice for Henry" and "We Believe Survivors." Women's groups organized rallies. The national conversation about narcissistic mothers, about golden child and scapegoat dynamics, about elder abuse and family financial manipulation reached a fever pitch. Eleanor became a symbol, a cautionary tale about what happens when privilege and narcissism go unchecked for decades. Op-eds appeared in major newspapers analyzing the case through various lenses: the psychology of family abuse, the legal implications of elder murder, the ways our society fails to recognize abuse when it doesn't fit our preconceived notions. A criminologist from Ohio State wrote a piece about how Eleanor represented a particular type of female killer who uses poison and manipulation rather than violence, who hides behind respectability and social standing. A psychologist wrote about maternal narcissism and how children of narcissists often don't realize they've been abused until adulthood. I received thousands of messages during those 2 weeks from women across the country who saw their own mothers in Eleanor, who saw themselves in me or in Lydia, who were finding the courage to name their own abuse for the first time. "Thank you for speaking up," one woman wrote. "My mother treated me exactly the way yours treated you, but I thought I was crazy that I was the problem. Seeing you fight back gave me permission to finally cut contact with her." Sentencing day arrived on a humid morning in late June. The courtroom was packed again, every seat filled with journalists, advocates, curious citizens, and the people who'd supported us through this entire ordeal. Lydia and I sat in the front row with Russell between us, our prepared statements folded in our hands. Eleanor was brought in by the bailiffs, and the change in her appearance was stark. She'd lost weight in jail, her face was gaunt, and without her expensive hair and makeup regimen, she looked every one of her 65 years and more. The judge, the same stern man who'd presided over the trial, reviewed his notes before looking up at us. "Before I impose sentence, Ohio law provides the victims of crimes the right to address the court. Does the victim's family wish to make statements?" I stood my legs steadier than I'd expected them to be and met the judge's eyes. "Yes, Your Honor, we all do." The courtroom erupted again. Someone in the gallery screamed. The judge pounded his gavel repeatedly, threatening to clear the room. When order was finally restored, Lydia continued through her sobs. "Mom told me it was a special heart supplement that Dr. Morrison had prescribed. She showed me a pill bottle with an official-looking pharmacy label on it. She said Dad needed it every morning in his oatmeal, that it would help his heart. I was 30 years old, and I still didn't question her. I was too afraid of what would happen if I disobeyed. Lydia looked at me, then her eyes full of anguish. I put that powder in Dad's breakfast every morning for months. I helped kill our father, and I didn't even know I was doing it. When the toxicology report came back showing arsenic, when I realized what that powder really was, I wanted to die. Eleanor stood up so fast her chair fell backward. "Lydia!" she screamed, her carefully constructed mask shattering completely. "How could you betray me like this? After everything I did for you, I made you beautiful. I made you perfect. I gave you everything." Lydia's response was quiet, but everyone in the courtroom heard it. "You made me a murderer." Eleanor's attorney was pulling at her arm, trying to get her to sit down, but she shook him off. "You ungrateful little bitch! You were nothing before I molded you, nothing." The judge's gavel came down like thunder. "Mrs. Cole, sit down and be silent, or you will be removed from this courtroom." Eleanor finally sat, but the damage was done. The jury had seen behind the mask, had witnessed the rage and narcissism she'd been hiding beneath the performance of grief. Several jurors were staring at her with undisguised horror. The trial continued for another 3 days, but everyone knew it was over. The jury deliberated for 3 days, and when they filed back into the courtroom, not one of them looked at Eleanor, a sign every lawyer knows means conviction. The foreman stood holding the verdict form with both hands. "We, the jury, in the case of the State of Ohio versus Eleanor Marie Cole, find the defendant guilty of murder in the first degree, guilty of aggravated murder with torture, guilty of insurance fraud, guilty of forgery, guilty of witness tampering, guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty on all counts." The judge nodded at us, and Lydia stood first, her prepared statement clutched in trembling hands. She walked to the podium, positioned between the prosecution and defense tables, adjusted the microphone, and took a deep breath before speaking. "I'm 35 years old," she began, her voice shaking but growing stronger with each word. "And I'm only just now learning who I am, without my mother's voice in my head telling me what to think, what to feel, what to be. She didn't love me. I understand that now. She owned me. She controlled every single aspect of my life and made me complicit in murder without my even knowing it. I lost my father because of her, and I almost lost myself." Lydia paused, wiping tears from her cheeks. "But I'm reclaiming my life now. I have my own apartment, my own job, my own bank account, my own choices. For the first time in my life, I'm free. And she can never take that from me again." Lydia walked back to her seat, and I squeezed her hand as she sat down. Russell stood next, moving slowly to the podium with the deliberate care of a man carrying a heavy burden. He didn't need notes. He'd lived this story. "Henry Cole was my best friend for 40 years. Russell said, his voice rough with emotion. "We met in college when we were both 20 years old. We built a business together. We stood up at each other's weddings. He was the brother I never had by blood, but chose in every way that mattered. He was honest, generous, and kind to his core." Russell's hands gripped the sides of the podium. "He died knowing his wife wanted him dead. That knowledge haunted his final days. He told me once near the end, 'I can feel her waiting for me to die, Russell. I can see it in her eyes.' I didn't understand what he meant at the time. I thought it was the medication talking the fear of a sick man. But he knew. He knew, and I failed to protect him." Russell turned to look directly at Eleanor. "You took a good man from this world far too soon. You tortured him for 2 years and then had him killed in his hospital bed. You'll spend the rest of your life in prison paying for that, and it still won't be enough." When Russell sat down, I stood and walked to the podium on legs that felt steadier than I'd expected. I'd practiced this statement so many times that the words felt like they'd become part of me. But standing there in front of the judge, in front of my mother, in front of everyone who'd followed this case, I felt the weight of the moment settle over me like a mantle. "Your Honor, my name is Marissa Cole, and Eleanor Cole spent 38 years of my life making me believe I was worthless. I looked directly at my mother as I spoke. You told me I was a disappointment, a burden, a mistake. You compared me to my sister and found me lacking every single time. You made sure I knew that I wasn't good enough, that I would never be good enough, that there was something fundamentally broken in me that made me unlovable. My voice was steady, clear. But you were wrong about all of it. I am a successful businesswoman. I am loved by people who matter. I have integrity and compassion and strength that you will never understand because you've never possessed any of those qualities yourself. I paused, letting my words sink in. You killed a good man, not because you needed to, not because you were in danger, but because of pure greed. You poisoned him slowly for 2 years, watching him suffer every day, and then you had him killed in his hospital bed. You destroyed your own daughter's childhood for control and money. You tortured a man who loved you, and raised children who weren't his blood, but whom he chose to love anyway. And then when you'd collected your blood money, you bragged about it on camera. My hands weren't shaking anymore. You tried to break me. Instead, you made me unbreakable. You tried to erase me from Dad's life. Instead, you proved exactly why he loved me, because I am nothing like you. I see love as a gift to be given freely. You see it as a transaction to be manipulated. Today, justice is being served, and I want you to know something. I paused, meeting her cold eyes across the courtroom. I forgive you. Not because you deserve forgiveness, but because I deserve peace. And you no longer have any power over me. You never will again. I walked back to my seat, and to my surprise, the gallery erupted in applause. The judge made no move to stop it, letting it continue for several long moments before calling for order. The judge, a woman in her 60s named Catherine Morrison, reviewed her notes one final time before looking up at Eleanor. Mrs. Cole, I have presided over criminal cases in this court for 25 years. I have seen crimes of passion, crimes of opportunity, crimes born of desperation and mental illness. But I have never in all those years encountered a defendant who displayed such callous disregard for human life combined with such complete and utter lack of remorse. Judge Morrison's voice was hard as steel. The premeditation involved in this case is staggering. You poisoned your husband slowly over 2 years, making him suffer every single day. You manipulated a doctor into administering a fatal dose of medication. You forged your husband's will to steal your daughter's inheritance. You manipulated your other daughter into unknowingly participating in murder. You attempted to frame an innocent person for your crimes. These are not the actions of someone who was mentally ill or who was manipulated by others. These are the actions of a calculating, narcissistic individual who believed she was above consequence and above the law. The judge looked down at her sentencing documents. For the crime of murder in the first degree, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. For the crime of aggravated murder with torture, I sentence you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole to run concurrently. For insurance fraud, I sentence you to 15 years. For forgery, I sentence you to 5 years. For witness tampering, I sentence you to 5 years. The fraud and tampering charges will run consecutively to the life sentence. She looked up at Eleanor. This means, Mrs. Cole, that even if your murder conviction were somehow overturned on appeal, you would still serve 25 years in prison for your fraud. But make no mistake, you will die in prison. That is my judgment. The judge asked if Eleanor wished to make a statement. For a moment, I thought she might stay silent, might finally show some shred of dignity or remorse. But then she stood, and the look on her face was pure venom. My daughters will never escape me, she said, her voice cold and clear. I'll haunt them for the rest of their lives. And they should remember, blood doesn't lie. They're both as worthless as their real fathers were. The judge's gavel came down hard. Remove the defendant from my courtroom. As the bailiffs took her arms to lead her away, Eleanor turned her head and looked directly at me one last time. She leaned slightly in my direction, and though the bailiffs were already pulling her toward the door, I heard her whisper just loud enough for me to catch the words, "You'll become me someday, Marissa. Bitterness destroys everyone eventually. Then she was gone, led through the side door that would take her back to jail and then to prison for the rest of her life. I sat there feeling strangely empty, waiting for relief or triumph or closure, but mostly just feeling tired. 3 months later, I was at work when my phone started buzzing with emergency news alerts. I looked down at the screen and felt my blood run cold. Breaking news. Eleanor Cole, convicted of murdering her husband, has escaped from Ohio Women's Correctional Facility during a medical transport. Authorities believe she had help from a corrections officer. She is considered dangerous. If you see her, do not approach. 3 months had passed since Eleanor's sentencing, and I'd finally started to feel like I could breathe again. Lydia and I had moved into a larger apartment together. Russell came by for dinner every Sunday, and I'd begun working with a publisher on a book about recognizing and escaping family financial abuse. Life was beginning to feel normal, or at least what I imagined normal might feel like for someone who hadn't spent 38 years under Eleanor's thumb. Then, at 2 a.m. on an October night, my phone rang. Russell's name flashed on the screen, and the urgency in his voice when I answered sent ice through my veins. "Marissa, turn on the news right now." I stumbled into the living room and grabbed the remote, and every local channel showed the same breaking news alert. Eleanor's booking photo filled my television screen, while the anchor's grave voice reported that she had escaped from the Ohio Women's Correctional Facility during a medical transport to an outside hospital. Authorities believed a corrections officer had assisted her escape. She was considered armed and dangerous. I stood there in my pajamas, the remote still in my hand, feeling strangely calm despite the situation. Lydia emerged from her bedroom, having heard the television, and when she saw the news, her face went pale. "Oh my God, she's out! Marissa, she's going to come after us." "Probably," I said, and I was surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "But she's not going to win." An hour later, my phone rang again from a blocked number. I answered it on speaker so Lydia could hear my other hand already pulling up Detective Moore's contact information. "Hello, daughter." Eleanor's voice was exactly as I remembered it, cold and precise, despite her circumstances. "Did you really think prison could hold me?" "How did you get out?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral and hitting record on my phone. She laughed, and the sound made my skin crawl. "It's remarkable what a lonely man will do for the right kind of attention." Kevin Torres had only been working at the facility for 6 months. Young, idealistic, unhappy in his marriage. I spent 3 months cultivating him, making him feel seen and special. He gave me a burner phone, civilian clothes, and $2,000 in cash. All I had to do during my medical transport was wait for him to create the right distraction. "And now what?" I asked. "You're a fugitive. Every law enforcement agency in the state is looking for you. Now I come for what's mine." Her voice turned venomous. "You took everything from me, Marissa. My freedom, my money, my reputation, my life. I know where you live. I know where Lydia lives. I know where that meddling Russell lives. I'm going to take everything from you, just like you took everything from me." "Then come and get me," I said quietly, and ended the call. Lydia was shaking, tears running down her face. "Marissa, we need to run. We need to hide. She's going to kill us." "No," I said, already dialing Detective Moore. "She's going to try, and we're going to be ready." Within 2 hours, I was sitting in an FBI field office with Detective Moore and 3 federal agents who'd taken over the manhunt. I laid out my proposal as calmly as if I were pitching a business plan. Eleanor wants revenge specifically against me. She's emotional, desperate, and not thinking clearly. That means she'll make mistakes. Let me be the bait to draw her out. The lead agent, a woman named Sarah Chen, looked skeptical. "Ms. Cole, your mother has already murdered 1 person and attempted to frame you for it. Putting you in her crosshairs intentionally is extremely dangerous." "More dangerous than waiting for her to ambush me on her terms," I countered. "She knows where I live, where I work, where I go. At least this way we control the location and timing." After hours of debate and planning, they agreed. That afternoon, I posted on all my social media accounts, making sure to use platforms Eleanor had shown me over the years that she monitored. I uploaded a photo of the family mansion and wrote, "Taking some time at the old family house to reflect and heal. Sometimes you have to face your past to move forward. Spending the evening here alone with my memories." That evening, I drove to the mansion where I'd grown up, where this entire nightmare had begun exactly 1 year ago at a Thanksgiving dinner. The house had been seized by the court and sat empty, awaiting final determination of asset distribution. FBI agents and SWAT team members took positions throughout the property, hidden but ready. I walked through the front door, turned on the light in the formal dining room, and sat down in the same chair I'd occupied that fateful November night. I wasn't afraid. I'd been afraid of Eleanor my entire life, and I was done with fear. I was ready to end this once and for all. The house was silent, except for the old familiar creaks and settling sounds I remembered from childhood. I sat there for 2 hours waiting, knowing she would come. Eleanor's narcissism wouldn't let her resist the opportunity to confront me on what she still considered her territory. I heard her before I saw her, the careful creak of the back door, the soft footsteps moving through the kitchen. "Marissa," her voice echoed through the empty house. "I know you're here. You always were predictable, coming back to this house like a dog returning to its master." She appeared in the doorway of the dining room, and I barely recognized the woman standing there. The elegant socialite who'd sat at the head of this table in expensive jewelry was gone. This Eleanor was gaunt and wild-eyed, her hair tangled, wearing clothes that were too big and clearly stolen. But what caught my attention most was the kitchen knife she held in her right hand, its blade catching the light from the chandelier. "There you are," she said, moving slowly into the room. "Sitting in your sad little chair, just like always. The disappointment daughter in the disappointment seat." I stood up slowly, keeping my movements calm and non-threatening. "Hello, Mother. Prison hasn't been kind to you." Her face contorted with rage. "You did this to me. You ruined my life. I gave you everything: a home, a family, a name to carry, and you destroyed me, you ungrateful, worthless. You gave me nothing." I interrupted, my voice steady and clear. "You gave me abuse. You gave me manipulation. You gave me 38 years of believing I was worthless. But you know what the funny thing is? You made me strong. Every cruel word, every humiliation, every moment you tried to break me just made me more determined to survive you." Eleanor raised the knife, her hand shaking with fury. "I should have killed you the day you were born. You were always wrong, always broken, always a mistake." She lunged forward, the knife aimed at my chest, her face twisted with hatred. But FBI agents burst through 3 doorways simultaneously, moving with the precision of a choreographed dance. One agent tackled Eleanor from the side before she'd crossed half the distance between us, sending the knife clattering across the hardwood floor. She screamed and fought as they forced her to the ground, as they pulled her arms behind her back and snapped handcuffs around her wrists. "Eleanor Cole, you're under arrest for escape from lawful custody assault with a deadly weapon and conspiracy to facilitate escape. You have the right to remain silent." She was still screaming as they lifted her to her feet, her voice raw and desperate. "You were always a mistake, Marissa. Always worthless. Just like your pathetic father." I walked closer to her, close enough that only she could hear my final words. "I was never the mistake, Mother. You were." They dragged her out through the front door to the waiting vehicles, and I stood in the doorway of my childhood home watching the red and blue lights paint the white columns. I felt Russell's hand on my shoulder. He'd been waiting outside with the police, and I leaned into him, slightly exhausted, but finally free. 6 months later, Eleanor was transferred to a maximum security federal facility in Pennsylvania. The escape assault and conspiracy charges added another 15 years consecutive to her life sentence. She would die in prison, forgotten by everyone except as a cautionary tale. But me, my story was just beginning. 6 months after Eleanor's final capture and transfer to maximum security, I received a call from a producer at Good Morning America. The story had captured national attention, a daughter who'd exposed her mother's decades of abuse and murder, culminating in a dramatic escape and recapture. They wanted to do a feature segment on family abuse, justice, and healing. I hesitated at first, tired of reliving the trauma for public consumption, but Lydia convinced me to accept. "This isn't about her anymore," Lydia said as we discussed it over coffee in our apartment. "This is about all the women still living with their versions of Eleanor who don't know they're allowed to fight back. You have a platform now. Use it." So on a bright April morning in 2026, I found myself sitting on the iconic curved couch in the Good Morning America studio, surprisingly calm as the cameras focused on me. The host, a warm woman named Jennifer Hayes, started with the expected questions about the trial, Eleanor's escape, the final confrontation. I answered them all honestly, but I could sense she was building toward something else. "Marissa, there's something that's puzzled many people following your story closely," Jennifer said, leaning forward with genuine curiosity. "You paid your mother's bills for 5 years, over $120,000. You hired private investigators, forensic toxicologists, document examiners. You funded a legal battle that must have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yet in all our background research, we found that you worked as a software engineer, making what public records suggest was a modest salary. How did you afford all of this?" I felt a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. This was the secret I'd protected for over a decade, the truth I'd hidden even from my own family until recently. "Jennifer, I need to come clean about something. I haven't been entirely honest about my professional life, and there was a very good reason for that. My legal name is Marissa Cole, but for the past 10 years professionally I've worked under a different name. I'm MC Rivera." Jennifer's eyes widened with recognition. "MC Rivera, as in Rivera Tech Solutions." "That's right. I founded the company in 2015, and I'm the CEO. The company was valued at $5 million in our last funding round." The studio audience gasped audibly. Jennifer sat back, clearly recalibrating the entire trajectory of the interview. "So when your mother was calling you a failure at that Thanksgiving dinner when she was mocking your little job with computers? I was running a tech company with 47 employees serving over 50,000 users and helping women across the country escape the exact kind of abuse she was inflicting on me. The liberation of saying it out loud, of finally owning my success, publicly felt like shedding a weight I'd been carrying for years. I kept my business completely separate from my family, using a professional pseudonym, because I knew that if Eleanor discovered I had money, the financial abuse would never stop. She'd have drained me dry and still called me worthless. Jennifer pulled up images on the studio screens showing Rivera Tech's website and various press coverage the company had received. "Your company specializes in financial management tools specifically designed for women in abusive relationships. That's incredibly specific. Tell us how this started." I took a breath, letting myself go back to that dark period. In 2014, when I was 28, my mother kicked me out of the family home after a particularly brutal argument. I left with $847 in my checking account, a duffel bag of clothes, and nowhere to go. I slept on a friend's couch and worked 3 part-time jobs just to survive retail during the day, restaurant at night, weekend shifts at a grocery store. I was exhausted, broke, and felt completely worthless, exactly the way Eleanor had always told me I was. Jennifer nodded sympathetically, and I could see several audience members wiping their eyes. One night, I was sitting in a 24-hour laundromat at 3 in the morning because I had nowhere else to go and I needed to do laundry before my morning shift. I was looking at my bank account on my phone. I had $212 left until payday, and I started thinking about why I'd stayed in that toxic situation for so long. The answer was always money, fear of financial instability, fear of not being able to support myself, fear of losing access to family resources even though those resources came with strings attached that were strangling me. I looked directly at the camera. So I decided to learn how to code. I used free online courses, spent every spare moment between my 3 jobs teaching myself programming. By 2015, I'd built a really rough prototype of an app that helped people secretly track their finances budget for leaving an abusive situation and find resources. I showed it to a friend who worked at a women's shelter, and she said, "Marissa, this could save lives." So I kept building. Jennifer was fully engaged now. "And your mother never knew any of this?" "Not until it came out during the trial. I used my middle name, Rivera was my grandmother's maiden name, and kept my professional life completely private. I let Eleanor believe exactly what she wanted to believe, that I was struggling, that I was the failure she'd always said I was. In a strange way, her underestimating me became my greatest protection. She was so convinced of my worthlessness that she never looked deeper." "The irony must be profound," Jennifer said softly. "Her cruelty essentially created your success." "That's exactly it. Eleanor's abuse gave me the empathy to understand what women in these situations need because I'd lived it. Her cruelty gave me the motivation to build something meaningful. Her financial manipulation taught me exactly what tools were missing in the market. She tried to break me, and instead she gave me the blueprint for building something that's now helped thousands of women escape situations just like mine." I felt emotion rising in my throat. My mother spent 38 years trying to convince me I was nothing, and in doing so, she created the exact person who could defeat her. Jennifer glanced at her notes. "So when you paid her $120,000 over 5 years. I could afford it, but I didn't pay it because I had to. I paid it hoping that maybe, just maybe if I was generous enough, helpful enough, perfect enough, she would finally love me. Obviously that never happened. But those payments became evidence of her financial abuse, so even that served a purpose in the end." The interview continued for another segment, covering the foundation I was planning, the book I was writing, how Lydia and I were rebuilding our relationship. When we finally wrapped, Jennifer hugged me and said, "You're going to change so many lives with your story." What I learned later from Russell was that Eleanor had watched the interview from prison. A corrections officer who'd been in the common room told him that Eleanor had been bragging to other inmates beforehand, saying her daughter was going to be on national television and clearly expecting some kind of validation. Instead, she'd sat frozen through the entire segment, watching me reveal the success I'd built, listening to me explain how her cruelty had fueled my empire, hearing me essentially thank her for being such a perfect example of what not to become. According to the officer, when the interview ended, Eleanor had stood up without a word and walked back to her cell. She didn't come out for meals for 3 days. Russell told me this with a grim smile. "She finally understands. She spent your whole life trying to destroy you, and instead she created exactly the person strong enough to bring her down. That's the irony she'll live with every day until she dies in that cell." Jennifer's final question during the interview had been simple but profound. "What's next for you, Marissa?" I'd smiled, thinking about my father, about all the women who'd reached out to me about the life I was finally building on my own terms. "I'm starting a foundation in my father's name, the Henry Cole Foundation for Family Justice. And I'm going to help thousands of daughters just like me understand that they deserve better, that they have the power to escape, and that their abusers don't get to define who they become." 1 year after that first Thanksgiving confrontation on what would have been my father's 76th birthday, I stood in a hotel ballroom decorated in elegant simplicity and watched 300 people gather to celebrate the launch of the Henry Cole Foundation for Family Justice. I'd used the inheritance my father had left me, the one Eleanor had tried to steal, along with $1 million of my own money, to create something that would honor his memory in a way that actually mattered. The foundation would provide legal aid, financial counseling, and mental health support for adult children escaping abusive family dynamics. Lydia stood beside me in a navy blue dress, her fiancé, Tom's hand resting supportively on her back. She'd taken the role of program director with a passion that surprised both of us, channeling her own healing into helping others. "Dad would be so proud," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "Not just of the foundation, but of us, of who we've become. Russell gave the opening speech, his voice steady, despite the emotion I could see in his eyes. He talked about Henry as a man who believed family was defined by choice and love, not by blood. He talked about integrity and courage and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it costs you everything. When he finished, the applause lasted for several minutes, and I saw more than a few people wiping their eyes. The gala raised over $500,000 that night, but what meant more to me were the conversations I had with survivors who approached me afterward. Women who'd seen my story and found the courage to leave their own toxic families. Men who'd been financially abused by parents and had felt too ashamed to name it. Adult children who'd spent decades believing they were the problem, finally understanding they'd been systematically manipulated. Each conversation reminded me why this work mattered, why my father's legacy needed to be about healing rather than bitterness. A week before Thanksgiving 2026, I did something I'd been putting off for months. I drove 4 hours to the federal correctional facility in Pennsylvania where Eleanor was serving her sentence. I'd told no one I was going, not Lydia, not Russell, not even my therapist, though I'm sure she would have had thoughts about it. I needed to do this alone, and I needed to do it for myself, not for anyone else. The visiting room was exactly as depressing as I'd imagined. Concrete walls, metal tables, the smell of industrial cleaning products trying to mask years of human despair. Eleanor was brought in wearing a prison uniform that hung loose on her frame. She'd aged dramatically in the year and a half since her final capture, her hair now almost entirely gray, her face lined and gaunt, but her eyes were the same cold, assessing, calculating even now. She sat across from me and smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Come to gloat." "No," I said quietly. "I came to say goodbye." "How touching," her voice dripped with sarcasm. The dutiful daughter visiting her poor imprisoned mother. "I'm not here for you," I interrupted. "I'm here for me. I needed to see you one last time so I could say something I've been working toward in therapy for months." I took a breath. "I forgive you." Eleanor's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You forgive me? How magnanimous! I don't want your forgiveness." "I know you don't. That's why I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for myself. I forgive you not because you deserve it, or because you've earned it, or because you've shown even a moment of remorse. I forgive you because I deserve peace, and I can't have peace while I'm still carrying around anger at someone who will never ever give me what I need from her." I leaned forward slightly. "You no longer have any power over me. You can't hurt me anymore. And that's the last thing I needed to know before I walked out of here and never came back." I stood up and Eleanor's mask finally cracked. "You think you've won? You think you're better than me? You'll become just like me eventually, Marissa. Bitter and alone. That's what happens to people like us." "No," I said softly. "That's what happens to people like you. I'm nothing like you, and I never will be." I walked out of that prison and felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even fully realized I'd been carrying. I would never see Eleanor again, and that knowledge felt like freedom. Thanksgiving Day arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp and bright. Instead of hosting at a mansion or even at my apartment, Lydia and I organized a community Thanksgiving at a local shelter that partnered with our foundation. We'd invited everyone who'd been part of our journey, Russell, of course, who arrived early to help set up tables, Sarah Collins. The nurse, whose testimony had been crucial to the case, came with her teenage daughter. Detective Moore and Prosecutor Walsh both stopped by. Members of the church who'd supported us through everything brought dishes and helped serve. 50 families we'd helped through the foundation joined us, and the room was filled with the sound of children laughing and playing. There was no $15,000 catered spread. Instead, everyone had brought something: casseroles and pies, simple dishes made with love rather than money. Lydia had made her first ever attempt at stuffing, and while it was slightly oversalted, we all ate it anyway and told her it was delicious. Tom proposed a toast to new beginnings, and I watched my sister's face glow with happiness I'd never seen in her during all those years under Eleanor's control. As we were finishing dessert, Russell pulled me aside and handed me a small wooden box I'd never seen before. "Your father wanted you to have this. I've been keeping it safe, waiting for the right moment. I think that moment is now." My hands trembled as I opened the box. Inside, nestled in velvet, was a silver locket on a delicate chain. I opened it carefully and found a tiny photograph of myself as a newborn, my father's face visible beside mine in the hospital. On the back of the locket was an engraving in his handwriting, "My daughter, my heart dad." "He had this made the week you were born," Russell said, his voice thick with emotion. "He wore it every day for 38 years under his shirt, where Eleanor couldn't see it. When he died, I took it before Eleanor could find it and throw it away. He loved you from the very first moment, Marissa. And he never stopped." I couldn't hold back the tears anymore. I sat there in that crowded, noisy, imperfect community center and cried for the father who'd chosen me, who'd loved me despite everything, who'd protected me even from beyond the grave. Russell put his arm around my shoulders and let me cry, and when I finally looked up, I saw Lydia crying too, and Tom and several others who'd gathered around us. After dinner, I needed a moment alone. I stepped outside into the cool evening air and looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. I thought about Eleanor's final words to me at her sentencing, that whispered threat, "You'll become me someday. Bitterness destroys everyone eventually." But standing there with my father's locket warm against my chest, I knew she was wrong. Bitterness doesn't destroy everyone. It only destroys those who choose to nurture it, who feed it and let it grow until it consumes everything good inside them. Eleanor had made that choice every day of her life. She'd chosen cruelty over kindness, control over love, money over meaning. I'd made different choices. I'd chosen to build instead of destroy, to heal instead of hurt, to transform my pain into purpose. I'd chosen forgiveness not for Eleanor's sake but for my own. I'd chosen love in all its messy, imperfect, beautiful forms. Through the window, I could see my chosen family inside Russell telling a story that made everyone laugh. Lydia and Tom with their heads close together, planning their wedding. Sarah Collins helping clean up, while her daughter played with other kids, all the families we'd helped now helping each other. This was what family was supposed to look like. Not performance or pretense or control, but genuine connection and mutual support and love freely given. I touched the locket at my throat and whispered to my father wherever he was, "I did it, Dad. I survived her. And I'm happy. I'm finally, truly happy." For 38 years, Eleanor had told me I was a failure, a disappointment, a mistake. She'd done everything in her power to break me, to make me believe I was worthless. But she'd failed. I'd built a successful company that helped thousands of women. I'd brought a murderer to justice. I'd created a foundation in my father's name that would help people for generations to come. I'd found love and family and purpose on my own terms. I was everything she said I could never be. And that was the sweetest victory of all. I returned to the table where love, real love, was waiting. And for the first time in 38 years, Marissa Cole felt completely, beautifully free. Outro. Call to action. 587 words. And that's where Marissa's story ends, but perhaps where yours begins. If you've made it this far, if you've listened to all 3 hours of this journey, from that devastating Thanksgiving dinner to Marissa's final moment of freedom, thank you. Thank you for bearing witness to her pain, her strength, and her transformation. Stories like this matter because they remind us that we're not alone, that the abuse we've experienced or witnessed isn't normal, and that healing is possible even when it feels impossible. I want to ask you something important. Have you ever felt like Marissa? Have you sat at a family table where you were made to feel small, worthless, or like you were never quite good enough no matter what you accomplished? Have you ever paid someone else's bills, covered their mistakes, or sacrificed your own well-being, hoping that maybe this time they'd finally love you the way you deserved? Have you ever been the scapegoat in your family while watching a golden child get praised for far less? If any of this resonates with you, I want you to know what Marissa learned: you are not the problem. You never were. And you deserve so much better than what you've been given. This channel exists to tell stories like Marissa's stories about people who were told they were nothing and proved everyone wrong. Stories about justice, redemption, and the kind of strength that comes from surviving things that should have broken us. If this story moved you, if it made you think or feel or see your own life differently, please consider subscribing to this channel. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Your support means everything, and it tells me that these stories matter, that they're reaching the people who need to hear them most. But more than subscribing, I want to hear from you. The comment section below isn't just for likes and emojis. It's a community, a place where we can share our experiences and support each other. So let me ask you, what moment in Marissa's story resonated with you most? Was it the Thanksgiving dinner confrontation when she finally stood up to Eleanor? Was it learning that Henry had loved her all along, despite knowing she wasn't his biological daughter? Was it watching Lydia break free from the Golden Child prison and become her own person? Or was it that final scene when Marissa realized she'd become everything her mother said she never could be? Tell me in the comments. Share your thoughts, your reactions, your own stories if you feel comfortable. This is a safe space, and your voice matters here. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's still sitting at their own version of Eleanor's table feeling worthless and trapped, please share this video with them. Sometimes we need to see someone else's journey to freedom before we can imagine our own. Sometimes we need permission to name our abuse, to call it what it is, to stop making excuses for people who hurt us. This story might be that permission for someone you love. Before I go, I want to leave you with something Marissa said near the end of her story. She realized that bitterness doesn't destroy everyone, only those who choose to nurture it. Eleanor chose bitterness, control, and cruelty every single day of her life. Marissa chose differently. She chose healing, growth, and love. And that choice, made over and over again, even when it was hard, even when it hurt, made all the difference. You have that same choice. Every single day you get to choose who you become. Choose wisely. Choose yourself. Choose freedom. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next story.